Ladies and gentlemen, today is November 30th, 2025, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello?
Yo.
Hey, how are you?
Solid. Staying warm in sub-zero Fahrenheit temperatures here in South Dakota.
Yeah, it must be pretty cold up there by now.
Yes. Due to the continentality, it gets colder here than some places north of here because we're so far from ocean.
How inconvenient.
Yeah, it's like one of those things where if you go to South Dakota in the summer, especially if you go in the Black Hills area, which is really aesthetic and nice, you might be like, wow, this is a beautiful place. Like, why is this not way more popular? If you go here in the dead of winter when it's below 0 Fahrenheit, you understand. Oh, that's why.
Yeah.
Coincidentally, it's also why we have a homeless population of 0.
Yeah, they probably don't survive very long.
You simply cannot exist outside for more than minutes to hours, depending on your fitness level and insulation. But
Well, how was your week then?
It was good. Lots of Dota, decent bit of StarCraft, some BG3 Honor. We did Raphael with 2 characters, which was pretty badass.
How did that go?
Well, you know, smoke powder barrels.
Uh-huh.
She correctly predicted where his spawn position was in the room. So I think we had about 8 of them awaiting his arrival. So that was our first turn. And we had also convinced Yurgir to join us back in Act 2. So we had both Yurgir helping us. We each summoned a elemental. And then, yeah, we barreled him. It was probably for like the top third of his health pool just from barrels, and then we opted to not break the pillars because that blocks a lot of his more powerful abilities. It's interesting because you would think that they would want you to do the fight where you destroy an environment thing and then you kill him, so it's a longer fight. But if you destroy the pillars, then he ends up transforming and shit. It's way worse for you. He does crazy hellfire damage that covers the whole room. But if you leave him in the normal devil form, not the ascended form, then he just puts a charm on you if you attack him. So you can't attack him for 2 turns. But to me, that seems like way less of a big deal than hellfire all over the damn place, nearly killing you.
It is a very powerful ability.
Yep. We got Hope to help us as well. My character died in that room. There was a really weird angle. The imps can do Eldritch Blast and knock you back. And they just insta-kill you because there are a lot of cliffs in that room with the spectators. But the Hellcrawler boots, I think, make you unmovable by force. So she had those on, so we survived that encounter, freed Hope, and yeah. Owned Raphael. Who else do we fight? Gortash was a lot messier because he has a bajillion resistances. And it's kind of like an anti-caster almost. He's immune or resistant to basically every type of magic there is. So I did a lot of damage to him, but he had like 12 health, and it was hard for our sorcerer to kill him, so I was needing to be rezzed and so on. It's pretty cool trying to do it with 2 characters. Adds a lot of intensity. You have to take all the fights super carefully. And then Dota's been solid. Had some really good clips, really good moments. Still grinding on that. And I actually had a quiz question for you, a Texas history quiz question.
Oh boy.
Yep. So there's a name that one of our lovely viewers pointed out being on a lot of signs and the names for a lot of places within Texas, and they didn't know what it was named after. Now, it's not Stephen F. Austin, but that name was on a lot of stuff as well. And this person was the second president of the Republic of Texas.
He had a funky French name, as I recall.
Ooh, that's correct.
I think it started with an L. It
Ooh.
wasn't Lafayette, was it?
Nope, but the letter is correct. You're in the right section of your library.
Yeah, I really could not tell you what his name was, but I remember the guy you're talking about. And I haven't really seen a lot of stuff named after him up where I live, up here in North Texas.
You sure? A lot of streets are named after him. It's Lamar.
Lamar. Oh, okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I have seen some Lamar streets.
I remember seeing a lot of that. There's also Lamar County, which is where Paris, Texas is. That's how I got on this whole random Texas history thing. I was like, what's in Paris, Texas? And it's like normal tourist crap and a mini Eiffel Tower. Cool. And I think it was founded by Lamar or something. That's how I got onto that. But apparently, what's their first name? Just so we get the thing out there. Mirabeau. Mirabeau. I guess, I don't know how you would say it with an Americanized Texas accent. But he is a major proponent of early education in Texas. They call him the father of education in the state.
Yeah, I think he was... Yeah, I can see it here. He was sandwiched between terms for Sam Houston.
I see.
Houston was governor twice. He was the first, I think, president of Texas. And then Lamar, and then Houston came back. Yeah, Lamar, not an especially memorable figure.
Sam Houston was a general, I think, in the War for Independence.
He was, but he was also a well-known politician and a frontiersman. He's actually a very interesting figure. When he was younger, he was known for being a drunkard. Also spent a lot of time with Native Americans. He was actually on pretty friendly terms with them. Pretty neat guy. If you'd known him back in his day, you would not have really thought of him as a major historical figure. He wasn't one of those kinds of guys. He was more just like regular dude almost. Just kind of happened to be in a position of leadership during historical events.
Not too charismatic, you mean?
Yeah, kind of charismatic. He was an effective politician, but he was also kind of a fuck up, like in his personal life. You know, failed business ventures, that kind of thing. And he was probably better at politics than most of the other stuff he ended up doing.
There wasn't really a ton of stuff that stood out to me as big for this week in terms of news. I did talk to my dad a little bit about the effort to have peace talks and ceasefire and stuff in Ukraine. I don't know if there was a update on that this week at all.
There were some new talks in Miami between Ukrainian officials and Trump admin officials, but nothing came out of it from what I read of it. So not really much changed. It is clear that the terms of the agreement are being adjusted. So the initial announcement of the agreement is very clearly unacceptable to a range of actors, and they have been adjusting it to fit more with the needs and interests of Ukraine and Europe in particular. But there hasn't been any real traction in terms of fully accepting the agreement. So it seems like my reading was pretty much correct, that it's probably just not going to go anywhere. The negotiations are technically ongoing.
I see. And there was one question from chat already from a first-time Twitch watcher, normal YouTube watcher of the segment. Can you explain how carbon pricing works for firms in different countries? And touch on how it works when applied directly to consumers. Canada has carbon pricing for individuals, but no idea how it works. Shout out to Waldrug, South Dakota, epicenter of jackalope souvenirs. You went to the Sturgis bike rally and saw a woman wearing only assless chaps when you were a kid. Memorable road trip. I can see that.
Very colorful. Yeah, I'm not, as far as public policy goes, I've never paid a whole lot of attention to climate stuff, climate-based public policy. It very rarely goes anywhere. There's always lots of negotiations about it, but generally there's not enough consensus to do anything big, especially in the international realm. Generally, the most you see is in domestic politics. So, for example, Canada being the case in point. So I haven't really paid too much attention to it. I've always been more of a trade and conflict guy as far as that goes. But I do know a little bit. I mean, I can kind of give you the basic principle. Some of it is kind of subjective, like how do you determine? I mean, for those of you not familiar with like a carbon trading regime, like at all, just to give you the broad outline, basically the idea is that when manufacturers or miners or whatever firm engaged in activity that results in the emission of carbon dioxide, supposedly the idea is to get them to pay for the negative externality that those emissions cause. So in economics, we have this idea of negative externalities, which is basically stuff that creates a negative impact, but which is not really priced into the product. So, when you make something, you have to pay for the labor, you have to pay for property, you have to pay for equipment. And so all of those costs go into the price and are factored in to whether or not people want to buy the product that you make. But there are some things that create an impact, on your community, your surroundings, your environment, which don't actually cost you anything as the producer, and which then are not priced into the final price of the product. And so people do not really take that into account when they buy the product, unless they're, really dialed into whatever particular aspect of harm you're doing to the community. So one such example is pollution. So if you're producing something that causes a lot of pollution, you're probably not being charged for it. That used to be more true before, environmentalists created a whole slew of regulations and sort of developed economies as well as increasingly developing economies. But even so, when it comes to carbon dioxide, there really wasn't a lot there until relatively recently. Now, of course, you can just pass a law that says you can't emit carbon dioxide, but that's not very practical because just so many processes emit, some degree of carbon dioxide, either explicitly or implicitly. What I mean there is that, if you're burning something as part of the process by which you manufacture something, that's explicitly emitting carbon dioxide. But you can also make stuff during the process of which you're not emitting carbon dioxide, but which implicitly emits carbon dioxide because you're consuming parts and components to make that stuff, the manufacture of which actually does emit carbon dioxide. So basically, your suppliers are emitting carbon dioxide in their processes. And so you then are kind of culpable in those emissions because you are sort of one of the end consumers of those components. So the idea behind a carbon pricing scheme or a carbon trading regime is to try to force producers to incorporate some kind of cost into the price of their product that reflects the damage that is being done by carbon emissions on the environment. So that's roughly the gist of it. So a carbon trading regime basically tries to measure the amount of carbon that given companies emit as part of their operations, and then tries to attach some kind of price for that that those companies have to pay for. Now, the exact implementation of this kind of differs from country to country, and I'm not dialed into like the specific designs to really go into detail as to how they differ. In the United States, we have some wherein companies that don't emit carbon emissions or that are involved in basically the same industries as companies that produce emissions, but produce the same product in a way that is environmentally friendly, those firms are given what are called carbon credits. And firms that emit carbon dioxide basically have to buy those credits in order to cover their carbon emissions. And so that's how the cost of the negative externality is incorporated into the price. And it has the nice side effect of siphoning money implicitly into clean energy industries so that they can develop faster and ideally eventually supplant their dirtier equivalents. I think in Canada, it's the government that kind of issues the carbon credits, but you'd have to talk with somebody more familiar with it than I if you wanted to really get into that. But that is a rough outline of how carbon trading works. And again, the idea is just to try to put a cost on carbon so that it can actually be incorporated into the price and thereby discourage basically dirty production, so to speak, the emission of carbon in processes in the operations of firms. Yeah, I think it's California that has a carbon trading regime. I'm not sure if any other state, though, does. If they do, I haven't heard of it. I think I've heard carbon trading criticized before by economists. It's been a long time since I've read about it, so this is kind of off the top of my head. But I think I remember the criticism being that it doesn't really reduce the emission of carbon. Basically, it's just a tax on firms that do stuff that produces carbon emissions. And so while that does discourage people from buying those products in so much as they're relatively more expensive, the firms themselves don't really seem to be all that inhibited. And so some economists argue that if the ultimate objective is to shift away from a carbon economy towards one that produces stuff cleanly without emitting lots of carbon dioxide, then it can't really be said that carbon trading regimes are all that effective, because they haven't really had that particular effect. Yeah, people used to talk a lot more about them maybe like 10 years ago, kind of around 2016, sort of around the late Obama, early Trump era. Climate change, environmentalism, and carbon trading in particular were very common items in the public policy discourse. But we've seemed to have shifted pretty far from that at this point. Climate change isn't quite as prominent a political issue these days for a variety of reasons.
I see. I think we did have another question that Fuzzy could pass along too. Perhaps.
You've got me thinking about Texas now.
Sure, what you got?
Well, I was thinking of Lamar being obviously of French descent, and it reminded me that Texas was technically claimed by France at one point. Probably most Texans know that, but maybe it's a little more obscure outside of Texas. It's kind of bullshit because technically France did claim some of Texas, but it was a pretty small amount and it was a very short-lived claim. It was basically just southeastern coastal Texas. They had a fort very briefly for just a couple of years along the coast of Texas, and the Spanish later on drove them out because the Spanish obviously claimed Texas. So it's the most threadbare of claims, but technically it counts. Which is why their flag is included in Six Flags. Which is probably the only reason people in Texas know about it.
Can't say Six Flags didn't teach us stuff then.
Do you know all the Six Flags, Neuro?
Spain, France, Mexico, Texas, United States. Confederacy?
Correct. You nailed it.
Nice.
I'm impressed. I would have struggled with that. There's always one or two I forget for whatever reason.
Just name all the people who've been to the Americas. No. England didn't have it, I guess.
No, although there was discussion about Texas being incorporated into the British Empire at one point as a kind of protectorate. That was when Texas was still an independent state in the 1830s and early 1840s. But it didn't really go anywhere, and it was never really a serious proposition. That was basically the Republic of Texas trying to convince the US government to annex Texas as a state by creating a dark horse, basically pretending that, hey, if you don't do this, then we're going to join up with the British so that they'll protect us. But the Texas government never really wanted to be part of, the British Empire. They were mostly just trying to scare Washington into doing what they wanted. But technically, it was discussed. Probably helps that that was a time of tension in the Anglo-American relationship. Have you ever heard the phrase 54-40 or fight?
It sounds vaguely familiar, but
yeah.
What does it refer to?
It refers to a border dispute between the British and the US regarding the boundary between Western Canada and the US. Specifically the boundary between what is now British Columbia and the state of Washington.
Ooh.
Yeah, there was a big dispute about it for a couple of decades. For a long time, neither government really pursued it too much because the claim was kind of amorphous. Neither party really had a lot of people on the ground, and it was really far away. The Pacific Northwest was very difficult to get to for a very long time. There weren't any trains or anything by which you could get to it quickly over land, so you had to travel by sea. But in an era before the Panama Canal, that meant traveling all the way down south under South America and then back up north all the way up to the Pacific Northwest, which was one hell of a voyage.
Mm-hmm.
So the logistical difficulty of it kind of put the issue on the back burner. But in the 1830s and 40s, the population of the region spiked because of basically the land rush in Oregon. And so that brought the issue to the forefront. And a lot of nationalists, populists, expansionists, what have you in the United States were adamant that the boundary should be, 54 degrees latitude? I forget what the 54-40 was supposed to mean. But basically, of the latitudes that were being discussed as what the boundary would be, they wanted the most northerly of those options. The British, of course, were pushing for a latitude considerably south to the one they ended up with. Unsurprisingly, the compromise ended up being basically between between the claims made by the British and the American government, and that's how we ended up with the latitude that we have now. Yeah, the British basically wanted all of Puget Sound. All of that would have been British if they had gotten their preferred latitude. By contrast, Washington's preferred latitude would have netted the U.S. Pretty much all of what is now Vancouver and Vancouver Island. So it was an impactful decision.
Those.
Huh?
They compromised between those then.
Yeah. Basically, they split the difference. So the British got Vancouver Island, whatnot, and the U.S. got the bulk of Puget Sound. But there was real concern that there might be a conflict over it, since the nationalists in the United States were uncompromising about it. They were basically all but demanding that the United States get their preferred latitude or fight a war with the British. Hence the slogan 54-40 or fight.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as it was, the United States ended up fighting a war with Mexico in 1845 over the annexation of Texas. Among other things, boundary dispute was also in play. And that meant that Washington was pretty well distracted. And that made Washington much more amenable to a negotiated settlement than they had been leading on up till that point. So the result was a peaceful negotiation of the dispute. One of the unintended consequences of the Mexican-American War, you could say. Let's see. What was the question? Saw something on the news about Trump supporting a candidate in Honduras' recent elections. Yeah. I was under the impression that openly doing that was frowned upon because it can be read as interference. It is interference, and it is frowned upon for that reason. So is Trump able to get away with bad manners because he's the president of the U.S., i.e., would a president of a less important country have repercussions? Kind of like he can force everyone into his BS rules. Has world diplomacy devolved? Well, it definitely has. When the global hegemon misbehaves, that definitely has broad ramifications for global diplomacy writ large. But the reason he gets away with it is not just because the U.S. is a powerful country. It's also because there's not any actual international laws on this. Not interfering in the affairs of another state by explicitly backing a candidate in a pending election is not an international law. It's an international norm. So it's something you're just not supposed to do, but which you actually technically can do, more or less without consequence. I should say without legal consequence. There actually are some consequences, which is that if you interfere in their politics, it's kind of tit for tat. They have a right, basically, to interfere in your politics, and it can kind of spiral out from there. So most leaders kind of recognize the wisdom of not interfering, at least too openly, in other countries' politics, and certainly in their elections, because they're generally concerned that the targets of their interference may return the favor in a very uncomfortable way in the future. The United States historically has interfered considerably in Central America, so that's not really new. But since the Cold War ended, Washington hasn't really given too much of a shit about shenanigans in Central American politics, unless they're just really explicit to the point where they can't really be ignored. So Trump is breaking that norm more so than he's breaking the norm of not interfering in Central America, which Washington had never really recognized. So this is a change more so in the past 30 years of American indifference to the region. But beyond that, it's not necessarily surprising in the grand scheme of things, and there really wasn't anything stopping Trump or Obama or Bush or anybody else from having done it before, beyond just not really caring to do so, not really seeing it as worth it. Other countries could do it, but again, they just don't see it as worth their time or the effort or the inevitable backlash, from the country you're interfering with, as well as possibly domestically. Also, keep in mind it can blow up in your face too. For example, when Trump weighs in on another country's elections by backing a candidate or threatening to withhold aid if his preferred candidate doesn't win, which is something he's also done with Honduras recently, it's entirely possible that the impact of your threats has the opposite of the intended effect. Basically, that there's a rally around the flag effect, that nationalists in the country that you're interfering in reject your candidate of choice specifically because you're backing him. It would be easy for opponents of that candidate to paint him as a puppet of a foreign government if a powerful foreign government is explicitly backing him. So foreign backing like that is a double-edged sword. It's not necessarily purely beneficial. In the case of Central America, it actually does come with some benefit, just because the United States has so much influence in Central America and has for more than a century now. Countries in Central America are like very aware of how much influence Washington has, and it's basically a norm in their foreign policy to defer to Washington's foreign policy preferences. Washington doesn't even really have to crack the whip that hard in that regard. A lot of Central American governments will actually just adhere to Washington's preferences without them even asking, because they're afraid that if they don't, then there will be some kind of consequences. That hasn't been as explicit over the past 30-some years since the Cold War ended. And so some governments have kind of taken a little more leeway, been a little more independent in their foreign policy, especially vis-a-vis, say, China, which they've kind of established pretty strong economic ties with over the past couple decades. But those economic ties are not really all that threatening to the United States or to American influence. By far, the United States is the country in the world that has the most influence over Central American governments, even with the dramatic increase in economic ties with China among those governments. So it's not really all that big a deal. I don't think interference in their affairs is really all that justified at this point. They're not really misbehaving in terms of threatening American national security interests or what have you. So this kind of feels more like Trump just trying to establish a personal relationship with a foreign leader so he can extract some kind of favors later. He has a famously transactional approach to diplomacy, which has been on full display with leaders like Bukele in El Salvador or Milei in Argentina. So it seems he hopes he can have a similar arrangement with a conservative candidate in the Honduran elections. Whether or not that pans out, who's to say? It's still pretty early. He only kind of just did it in the past week. So whether there's a nationalist backlash or if it has the intended effect because there's too much concern about what Washington might do, we'll see. But it's not going to be good for America's image in the region, which is already pretty negative just because of generations of intermittent American influence. In general, America's reputation had been improving since there had been so much basically benign neglect from Washington of Latin America since the Cold War ended. But Trump seems hell-bent on reversing that. I don't think it'll have a positive impact, but we'll see. We'll see what happens. But yeah, there's no law against doing that. It's just a norm. And hypothetically, anybody would get away with it. But the United States is powerful enough to ignore even the implicit soft repercussions that would come from interfering in another country's affairs, that being that they would retaliate. The United States doesn't have to worry too much about that because there's a limit to how much Central American governments can realistically do, or really even most any government in the grand scheme of things. Actually, since this is Dagnip, he asked last week about the trade deals that the United States signed with 4 different Latin American countries. And I didn't have a great answer because I didn't have all the details about the agreements. And also, I was a little bit confused about an executive order that the administration issued around the same time. I thought they were interrelated. I thought the Trump administration negotiated deals with these states and then issued the executive order basically to implement their side of the deal. Turns out I was wrong about that. And I've also read more details about what was expected of the Latin American signatories of those agreements. Well, not signatories, but the states that were part of those negotiations. So I have a more substantive answer this week. I think better than last week when I didn't know much about it. So I can kind of clean that up if he's still interested. Also, I'm still looking through the slides that he sent. One of them has like 56 slides, though. So it's taking a while. Was there anything else you wanted to go touch on here, get to?
Don't think there was anything else that was jumping out at me specifically this week.
Okay. Let me see if I can find that trade stuff then. And we can do that. Oh, did you see the big fire
Where?
in Hong Kong?
No.
And there was a couple apartment blocks that caught fire. It's killed, what was it? How many people? Over 100 people dead, over 100 missing,
Damn.
79 injured. Yeah, I can send you some of the video of that. Yeah, it was the worst fire in Hong Kong in 70 years, according to what I read. Oh, here we go. Yeah, so to reiterate, last week I talked a little bit about 4 trade deals, quote unquote, because they're not treaties or any substantive kind of agreement, just sort of these informal handshake agreements that the Trump administration likes to negotiate. These were negotiated with 4 states: Guatemala, El Salvador, Ecuador, Argentina. And last week, I'd only really read about basically the agreements involving lower trade barriers for things like beef and other foodstuffs and a couple other items. But now I have more about what exactly the countries on the other side of these agreements, specifically Guatemala, Argentina, El Salvador, and Ecuador, are going to have to do as part of their end of the agreements, as well as some of the things that the United States is giving them as incentives. So I can kind of dig into this a little more and do a better job of answering Dagnip's original question last week, which is, do these agreements harm the interests of the Latin American states that agreed to them? And to give you a kind of spoiler, and not getting ahead too much, but kind of, but not really. They are making concessions here, probably much more so than the United States is. But the concessions the states in question have made are not that substantive. I don't think they're going to be very disruptive in the grand scheme of things, even if they sound like they will at first glance. Now, one thing to keep in mind about these agreements is that they are, once again, framework agreements, as the Trump administration likes to call them, which means that these are subject to change in the future as negotiations continue. So when a country agrees to a framework agreement with the Trump administration likes to tout it as some kind of big major trade deal, leaving out the fact that actually they've only basically just agreed to negotiate around the framework agreement, which means that a final deal is a ways off. So these agreements are not final, which means that we should not read too much into them at this point. So what we're going to talk about is the framework agreements and what would happen if they were implemented as they are. But keep in mind, that's probably not going to happen. There's likely to be changes made over the course of ongoing negotiations, And there's also likely to be changes due to political opposition within these countries, because invariably there are domestic political considerations that come out opposing this, that, or the other element within a trade agreement. And as part of the normal process of implementing these agreements, there probably will be changes that opposition demands and that governments have to enforce, which may or may not then be accepted by the Trump administration, which could result in the deals being canceled or being returned to an earlier stage of negotiation. So that's all just stuff to keep in mind here. So that said, what are some things, basically, what are the things that these four countries had to concede in order to reach an agreement here with the United States? So some of it just has to do with traditional demands made by Washington in pretty much all of its trade agreements. So the usual stuff here is requiring these states to improve and enforce intellectual property laws. The United States is a developed economy, has a lot of patented stuff, basically not just movies and whatnot, but inventions, formula, all manner of things that are protected by IP laws. And developing countries sometimes lack the administrative capacity to fully enforce IP laws, which can result in American firms that have protected content of one kind or another, seeing those protections disregarded in developing markets, resulting in a loss of revenue for them. Also, a lot of developing governments don't really give a shit. It doesn't really benefit them all that much to have strong IP regimes. Obviously, having a strong IP regime is helpful in so much as it encourages innovation within your country. But at the same time, it also means that stuff is going to be more expensive. Because if you have an IP regime, then basically you're granting a short-term monopoly to whoever innovated, whatever patent or what have you. And that can mean that that item will be more expensive for like the 10 or 20 years or however long the short-term monopoly is expected to last. It would actually be better for consumers, technically speaking, if they actually disregarded that and just let whoever can produce that innovated item the most cheaply make it. And that's kind of what a lot of developing countries implicitly do. There's a lot of stuff that is innovated and is technically protected by law in developed countries that could be made more cheaply by Chinese knockoff production. And if you're a low-income country with a lot of poor consumers, that's kind of preferable. You would rather have the cheaper item. But of course, that's a source of agitation for developed country governments. And so in their trade agreements, they generally try to push developing country governments to do better on that. Developing governments are generally willing to agree to that, but the follow-through is generally lacking because of the aforementioned lack of administrative capacity. So regardless, this is something Trump pushed in these deals. The counterparties agreed. We'll see if they actually do anything. But regardless, that is one of the things here that Washington usually pushes for that is present. Another item, pushing counterparties to improve enforcement of labor and environmental laws. Now, this is kind of a controversial one because in the past, developed country governments, including, if not especially, Washington, generally faces a lot of domestic political pressure within the United States, or if not the United States, then within their respective polities, to do more to try to get developing country governments to actually respect human rights, respect the rights of labor, and respect the environment, among other things. These are kind of big-ticket social issues in developed economies, but sometimes are not as much so in developing economies where economic development, higher wages, etc., standard of living, those are generally more important politically. However, developed country governments don't always really care about this stuff because corporations and other major economic actors in developed countries kind of benefit from the lack of attention paid to things like labor rights and the environment in developing countries. It's actually one of the reasons developing countries have lower costs of production as compared to developed economies. And Western companies of one kind or another appreciate that. They benefit from that. And by extension, consumers, sometimes more than others, also benefit from those lower costs in so much as they're passed on to consumers in the form of lower prices. And so governments kind of face a catch-22. Voters want trade agreements to respect things like environmentalism and labor rights. But major political actors, those being generally economic actors like firms, corporations, associations, chambers of commerce, what have you, they actually prefer the opposite generally. And so governments kind of face a difficult balancing act. So generally the way they would square that circle is that they would get foreign governments that they're in trade negotiations with to promise, quote unquote, to do better on this stuff. But generally the enforcement mechanism behind those promises in the agreement would be very weak, maybe non-existent. So you can go back to your voters in that case and say, hey, I got them to promise to do this. But then you can go to the corporations and whatnot and say, they probably won't do it, so don't worry about it. Now, the Trump administration actually has a somewhat better record on this, contrary to what people may think. The Trump administration is famously relatively more pro-labor than previous governments, especially Republican governments. Although I would really put the emphasis on relatively, because a lot of labor activists still complain and say that it's kind of superficial. But that's a whole conversation unto itself. Regardless, in the NAFTA renegotiated that resulted in the CUSMA agreement, there actually were teeth. That is to say, there were enforcement mechanisms of substance that were added to the agreement in order to actually pressure the Mexican government in particular to do better on things like labor rights and environmental law. So the Trump administration has exhibited that tendency again here in that they actually did try to push these governments to agree to do better. However, they seem to have reverted to traditional form in that there's no enforcement mechanism in the agreement. Now, keep in mind, this is still a framework agreement that could change in future, but at the moment, there's nothing really there. So technically it is present. They have paid lip service to the demand for labor rights and whatnot in partner countries, but it doesn't look like they cared as much this time because there's not much of substance there to actually get them to do it. So another thing here that is a normal part of Washington's trade negotiations, they've demanded continued support for the WTO moratorium on digital transfers. This is part of a broader digital package of stuff that frequently crops up in Western trade negotiations and in American trade negotiations in particular. They don't want digital services taxes, and they don't want any kind of regulations or whatnot inhibiting digital transfers. And this, of course, is because the American tech sector is dominant in the global economy. And if any country wants to tax, the internet or tech companies or social media companies, invariably that disproportionately negatively impacts American companies. And so Washington, of course, goes to bat for them by insisting in international forums and in any kind of international trade negotiations that partner states refrain from substantively inhibiting the operations of these companies. Aspects of that are uncontroversial. The moratorium on taxing digital transfers and regulating them in a way that inhibits digital transfers has been pretty beneficial to the global economy. It's made it much easier for tech firms, not only in the United States, but also internationally, to basically create a single global digital market. China kind of being the exception because they have the Great Firewall, but most everybody else is a part of a de facto single global digital economy. And that norm that is in place, that moratorium, is a big factor as to why that is the case. So that's pretty beneficial economically. People don't really mind that so much. Taxes, on the other hand, that's different. The European Union, for example, is famous for generating tension in its trading relationship with the United States. Not only with Trump in power, but even with Biden and actually also, I think, Obama back during their presidencies, by trying to pass taxes that target large tech companies, basically large online internet companies, groups like companies like Amazon, Facebook, etc. Basically your big FANG companies, or I guess Magnificent Seven now technically is what they're called. Europe argues that taxing and regulating them should just be normal, and that they're not going out of their way to target American firms. That just happens to be how it shakes out, just because American firms are so dominant. Washington, for more than 15 years now, has rejected that logic and insists that they're discriminatory and therefore illegal and unfair. So the United States, in turn, not only in negotiations with Europe, but basically every country it does trade negotiations with, insists that the counterparty adhere to not only the moratorium, but also refrain from implementing substantive taxes on tech firms. So all of that, not only the digital stuff, but the labor and environmental law stuff and the IP law stuff, all of that is a part of these agreements with these 4 countries. Unsurprising, it's just a normal part of the way Washington does this, and has been for a long time, up to and including the pre-Trump era. So a more controversial aspect of these agreements, I would argue probably the most controversial aspect, is regulatory alignment. This is interesting for me because historically trade agreements have focused mostly on lowering tariffs, but generally they haven't focused as much on regulatory alignment. And if you don't know what regulatory alignment is, basically that just means trying to get the regulations relevant to a given industry in all countries party to an agreement to be more or less the same. And if that sounds weird, just keep in mind that if you agree to lower tariffs on a given good, you can still prevent foreign producers from introducing that product into your market by drawing up regulations that make it effectively impossible for them to do that. So regulations are what are called a form of non-tariff barrier to trade, probably the most common form of non-tariff barrier to trade. And some of the more ambitious trade agreements that have been negotiated over the past 20 years have actually focused mostly on regulatory alignment in order to remove these and create what amounts to true single markets, or at least relatively close to true single markets. The trouble is that it's extremely controversial because when you agree to do this, you're kind of conceding a little bit of your country's sovereignty. Because if you're creating regulatory alignment, then you're going to have to negotiate alignment around something. And that something is probably going to be a larger, more powerful country's standards, which may or may not be acceptable depending on the preferences of your country's voters. They may have their own preferences different and distinct from those of other countries, and that can make regulatory alignment de facto impossible. And this is actually what we've seen in practice. Almost all of these agreements, these attempts anyway, at agreements that involve substantive regulatory alignment, have almost all failed to varying degrees. But generally, they face significant pushback from domestic political actors and the negotiating parties. Now, one successful example actually was the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which was that big controversial trade negotiation that involved basically most of the U.S.'s Pacific Ocean allied nations. So countries like Japan, Australia, the Philippines, etc., and a few countries that were not explicitly allies like Vietnam, and I think some Latin American states as well, like Colombia and Chile. It was a huge trade agreement, and it was very ambitious. There were some aspects of the agreement regarding lower tariffs, but by that point, tariffs globally were already very low on account of the World Trade Organization and a whole litany of bilateral trade agreements. So all of the low-hanging fruit on tariffs had pretty much already been picked, and they were already, on average, pretty low. The focus of the Trans-Pacific Partnership was more on regulatory alignment, because the negotiating parties all had pretty substantive non-tariff barriers to trade in place, and removing them could create pretty substantive, maybe not overall substantive economic growth, but pretty dynamic growth within certain industries that would have been impacted. As was the United States withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership after Trump was elected the first time in 2016, which was unfortunate timing because the Obama administration had basically just finished the negotiation, and all of the member states were actually in the process of ratifying the agreement. So Trump came in ahead of ratification and basically scuppered it. So the agreement has kind of been on ice since then, as far as the United States. However, the agreement actually went ahead with the other member states. They actually negotiated a new agreement, which was basically just the same agreement with a slightly different name. And I don't remember off the top of my head what it was. It was very similar to Trans-Pacific Agreement. But that agreement actually is in place and has been implemented by most of the states that have negotiated it. I think there were a few outliers where they weren't able to ratify it. But Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, I think the Philippines as well, and the Latin American participants as well, I think they all did end up ratifying it. So that agreement did go forward, and there has been substantive regulatory alignment on the part of those countries, just not the United States, which was sort of the original anchor of the agreement. But the fact that the United States withdrew kind of is itself an example of the controversial nature of regulatory alignment, because one of the big criticisms of the trade deal is just that it would have involved opening up American markets further to foreign competition in a way that would have created disruptions that would have hurt workers in the United States. Normally, that's a process historically that's played out in other countries. Normally, it's Washington trying to convince partner countries to overcome domestic opposition to sign a trade deal. With Trump, the shoe is very much on the other foot now. But Washington now, under Trump, has actually been doing something similar. They have actually themselves been trying to push partner states, specifically these four we're talking about now, to sign on to a degree of regulatory alignment. And that's why I say that this is the most controversial aspect of the deals with the four countries in question. So what exactly are we talking about here? So with Argentina, they agreed as part of the framework agreement to use U.S. or international standards for imports of goods made in the U.S., including automobiles. That's not too big an ask, actually. And Argentina, out of the four countries here, probably gave up the fewest concessions as part of its deal. I would point out this is not like a block deal, right? This was not a negotiated deal that involves all five countries negotiating the same agreement. Rather, the United States negotiated with the four states on a bilateral basis, and the result has been four separate agreements. So Argentina, for its part, gave up the fewest concessions. They're not really agreeing here to actually align their regulatory apparatus with that of the United States in any substantive way. There's just a generic, broad agreement to align on some issues, on some goods rather, to either U.S. standards or international standards. And the fact that international standards is in the agreement suggests that Argentina is being given an out here. If they don't like U.S. standards, they could default to international standards, and that would technically be fine under the terms of the agreement, which means that they could actually avoid regulatory alignment with the United States, because sometimes international standards differ from those of the U.S. And so if Argentina wanted to protect their markets, they could just adopt the international standards, and then that would have the implicit, or, well, in this case, the desired impact of inhibiting importation of American goods that they might not want for whatever regulatory reason or maybe just political reason. Now, Ecuador, by contrast, gave up more concessions on this. They agreed to reduce non-tariff barriers to trade for U.S. agricultural goods, including through changes to its licensing systems for food and agricultural products. That's a little bit ambiguous. They could probably given that wording, if that's what's in the final agreement, get away with not doing that, just because it's so ambiguous. The changes to their licensing system could be very minor, or maybe even just fail to manifest at all. Again, these are just kind of promises at this point, and promises don't really have enforcement mechanisms per se. So Ecuador also agreed to accept vehicles and automotive parts built in the U.S. According to U.S. motor vehicle safety and emissions standards. Also, U.S. medical devices marketed in the United States will be accepted, as well as U.S. pharmaceutical products marketed in the United States. So Ecuador here basically agreeing to open up its market to U.S. vehicles, medical devices, and pharmaceuticals by agreeing to just accept U.S. safety standards. If they pass muster according to U.S. safety standards, the Ecuadorian government will assume that they pass their own safety standards and will allow them to be imported uninhibited, without any of the normal procedures or paperwork that you might otherwise have to do. Now, that could be a substantive concession, but I would point out it's probably not going to be one. And the issue here is that a lot of countries around the world, especially in the developing world, basically already do this. So, for example, the FDA is the American agency responsible for vetting the safety of various food and drug items. A lot of countries around the world just don't really have the administrative capacity to do their own substantive testing of food and drugs like that. And so the result is that they very frequently just defer to the judgment of agencies like the FDA in developed countries. And the FDA itself is very frequently a measure in this regard that is used. So for the Ecuadorian government to promise to just assume stuff is safe because the FDA says it is, they were probably already doing that in part, or maybe just explicitly. So that's not too big a concession. That refers more to pharmaceuticals. Medical devices isn't really an FDA thing, but there's a similar dynamic with establishing the safety of things like medical devices. Not really quite the same thing with vehicles and automotive parts, but there's probably not a whole lot of difference between safety standards in that regard between Ecuador and the United States, just because the Ecuador already imports a lot of cars from the United States. And also, I would point out that developing countries, unfortunately, even when they have substantive safety standards and other regulations to that effect, frequently, due to corruption, struggle to actually enforce those provisions. So for Ecuador to promise to adhere to American standards doesn't really necessarily mean much if the country hasn't really been enforcing its own standards anyway. And it may be the case that due to corruption, they don't end up even enforcing the American standards that they've de facto agreed to recognize as equivalent to their own. Mileage will vary from country to country in this regard, depending on the degree of corruption. But for smaller countries in Central America, and to a lesser degree Ecuador, that is a problem. But because that's a problem, this is less of a concession. It's not really that big a deal for them in the grand scheme of things. So now we get to El Salvador and Guatemala, and in the source I read about this, both of them effectively agreed to the same concessions regarding regulatory alignment. And it probably won't surprise you if you're aware of how much influence the United States has over Central America, that El Salvador and Guatemala ended up giving the most concessions in these trade negotiations. So to go through the list really quickly, they agreed to do the following: streamline regulatory approvals, accept U.S. auto standards, simplify certificate of free sale requirements, allow electronic certificates, remove apostille requirements, and expedite product registration. So a lot of that is just very technical stuff that all has the same end objective, which is just to make it easier to import stuff into these countries. Normally there's paperwork and delays and approvals that you need. By agreeing to all this stuff, they kind of do away with a lot of that and make it so that you can just kind of send stuff out with relatively minimal muss or fuss. If you're curious what some of that actually means in practice, for example, certificate of free sale requirement, basically that's just a requirement that when you import something, you have a certificate that proves that it was sourced in the country that you're importing it from. So basically, this is just a regulation that makes it harder to engage in tariff evasion of one kind or another, since obviously there's an incentive to mislabel the origin of a given item so that it's subject to a lower tariff, or maybe evades a regulation or standard that would have otherwise prevented its entry into a country. So you can get a certificate that proves decisively that a given item was made in a given country that you say it was. Sometimes this can be a barrier to trade because it's an overly complicated process. And so El Salvador and Guatemala here have basically promised to make that process of getting those certificates a little bit easier, and also presumably verifying those certificates, since that's another aspect of the process that you can slow down in order to make importing stuff more difficult. Electronic certificates is exactly what it sounds like. It just basically means that instead of getting actual paperwork certifying the origin of the good, you can just submit it electronically. And apostille requirements are specifically the requirements that require the certification that we're talking about. So it all, again, sounds very technical, but it's all just, again, has to do with easing paperwork. So that's regulatory alignment, and like I said, they're not really doing much they weren't already doing, which is why I don't think it's all that big a deal. And I think in Argentina's case, it would be a bigger deal because they have a more administrative capacity, they have more industry, etc. And so more reason to kind of maintain their sovereignty and their own regulatory standards. But you'll note that in their case, they were kind of given an out. So it's not really that burdensome for them to actually adhere to the agreement as it stands now, presuming they don't change it, which they probably will. So let's see, what else is in the trade agreements? And we're still on concessions by the 4 Latin American countries. Agriculture was an item. The US government here kind of pushed these countries to open up their agricultural markets to US agricultural exports. In the case of Argentina, that's kind of a weird thing to do because Argentina is itself a major exporter of agricultural goods. So this was successful. They actually did get Argentina to nominally agree to do this. So specifically, they agreed to allow access for US poultry and poultry products within 1 year. They're going to get some time to actually do it, but technically they have promised to do it. They also agreed to simplify red tape for US exporters of beef, beef products, pork, and pork products. And they also agreed not to restrict market access for certain US meats and cheeses. US cheeses came up a lot in these agreements. It's kind of weird for some reason. I don't know why they ended up being such a major point.
Cheesecakes.
But regardless, yeah, presumably. But regardless, this is the stuff Argentina agreed to. I don't know that there's going to be a big bump to U.S. exports of beef or poultry, because this is stuff that Argentina itself has a comparative advantage in. But that could be why Argentina agreed to do this, because it's not going to be that disruptive to their market to import American beef and poultry. Certainly beef, because they already have so much. It will have the effect of lowering beef prices in Argentina, because there's just going to be more competition. But that'll be good for consumers. So I don't think it'll be all that controversial in the grand scheme of things. I think it'll be the most controversial with beef producers in Argentina, and they are a major political actor there because they are so important economically. But I think they're going to be compensated by greater access to the US market, which is nominally something Washington has promised, and also possibly greater access to foreign markets, which is something the Malay administration wants to do. For much of the past 20 years, there's been a lot of export restrictions placed on beef producers in Argentina. Those measures are intended to keep the price of beef down, but it also had the effect of limiting exports. which in turn capped growth in the industry and also capped the degree of foreign exchange that they could bring in. That's a whole topic unto itself. But basically, if they did lift those restrictions, there could be significant growth in exports, and that could compensate for whatever losses the beef industry in Argentina experiences due to greater competition from imported American beef. So this isn't too big a deal for Argentina. I think the bigger mystery is why Washington wanted to do it in the first place. I don't think this is going to be like a big growth industry for American agricultural exporters. So I kind of think they just wanted to do it for the sake of doing it. They kind of thought instinctively that greater access was better than less, and so fought for it. But otherwise, I don't think this is going to be that big a gain here for American beef producers. So Ecuador, for their part, agreed to remove or lower a range of tariffs on various products, including tree nuts, fresh fruit, pulses, wheat, wine, and distilled spirits. Some of that is stuff they don't really produce themselves, so lowering tariffs just kind of is a net positive for their economy. It'll be cheaper to buy that stuff for consumers, and there's not really any producers of note that will be put out by increases in imports of these items. So not really even a concession on their part. It's just an objectively good move. They also agreed to establish tariff rate quotas on a number of other agricultural goods. So in this case, they're not even agreeing to lower tariffs. They just agreed to establish quotas. So if you don't know what that means, basically that's a combination of quotas and tariffs. So you're going to limit the number of a given item that can be imported into your country within a given year. And those items, in addition to be subject to the quota, will also be subject to a tariff. Now, sometimes this is actually preferable, assuming the tariff is low enough, to just a tariff if the tariff is higher. Because at least with the quota, you're going to get some exports, whereas if the tariff is higher but there's no quota, you may not really get any. That is to say, if you're an exporter exporting into that country, you really may not get any sales if the tariff is too high. So the quota approach here, the tariff rate quota approach, is a compromise that frequently pops up in trade agreements because foreign exporters get a crack at the market, but then local producers still have a chance to compete because importers can only import so much of that given good on account of the quota. So Ecuador here got a beneficial, did make a concession by agreeing to do it, but this is relatively beneficial terms here for them. Because hypothetically, Washington could have just leaned on them to lower tariffs and not do any quotas. So they did get a quota here, which should protect whatever agricultural sector here that the Ecuadorian government was trying to protect. I don't really know what that would be, because I don't think Ecuador is a major producer of a whole lot of agricultural goods. I think they mostly do things like bananas, some coffee, maybe some rice and beef, and then a whole shit ton of oil. Oil's the main one. So on the whole, I don't think the Ecuadorian agricultural sector will be that disrupted if this agreement goes through as the framework is designed. So some concessions on their part, but nothing major. El Salvador, pretty similar. They committed to, and again, committed is carrying a lot of weight here because that basically just means they're promising to. They promised to, pinky swear, to prevent barriers to U.S. agricultural products, to recognize U.S. regulatory oversight, and to continue accepting agreed U.S. certificates and not restrict access of meats and cheeses. There's the cheeses again, including Parmesan, Gruyere, I'm almost certainly mispronouncing that, mozzarella, feta, Asiago, salami, and prosciutto? No idea how to pronounce that one either.
And the other one was Gruyere. It's a French
Gruyere.
word. Yeah.
Understood. Thank you.
Emphasis on the yeah. Gruyere. Oui.
So this is all stuff El Salvador agreed to do. This goes further than Ecuador or Argentina. Some of that has to do with American influence and pressure, but some of it also just has to do with the fact that this is stuff that they were already kind of doing. Recognizing U.S. regulatory oversight El Salvador, in a lot of cases, like with the FDA, was basically already doing that. So that's not that big a concession for them. Preventing barriers to U.S. agricultural products, there's probably not that many to begin with. So I don't think that's a big concession either, since El Salvador probably isn't importing a whole lot of agricultural goods from the United States. Maybe things like wheat and whatnot. But El Salvador itself doesn't really have the money for high-value ag goods and probably is mostly self-sufficient and stuff, since the country is actually pretty fertile. For those of you who don't know, El Salvador is the most densely populated country in Central America. It's actually got a surprisingly large population for a country that, if you look at a map, is very small. And that just has to do with the fertility of the soil and also fishing, which is another major source of food for the people there.
And I think El Salvador is Spanish for the savior.
Yeah, it's actually shorthand. I don't remember the full name, but the full name of El Salvador is like much longer. Let's see, etymology. Let me see if I can find it here. Well, maybe it is just the savior. I could have sworn originally it was something different. All right, I'll look into that later, because now I'm curious. But yes, you're correct, the savior. Let's see. So that's the stuff El Salvador agreed to. They agreed to more than Ecuador and Argentina, but it's not as much as it seems at first glance. Guatemala, exactly the same as El Salvador. However, they also made the promise to maintain science and risk-based frameworks in their regulations. So one of the ways that you can use non-tariff barriers to trade when you're designing regulations and standards and whatnot is you can just make shit up. You can just say that the way that a given item is produced or refined or what have you is dangerous. You know, that it involves something that's toxic or that consumption has negative effects or whatever. And then based off of that lie, you can ban import of that good. So when a country promises to use science and risk-based frameworks, they're basically promised not to just explicitly lie about the danger that a given product or process represents to consumers. But that's not really that big a deal. And it's going to be hard to actually enforce that in practice, since there's, again, a lack of administrative capacity in a lot of these countries. And in any case, there's lots of other non-tariff barriers to trade that you can always use anyway. So that's agriculture. There were a couple concessions made here regarding finished goods, but only by Ecuador and El Salvador. Guatemala and Argentina were not subject to these. Argentina doesn't surprise me. Argentina does have a relatively small but present industrial base. And so opening up the market there to American finished goods would actually be pretty notably disruptive to the market there and to the producers there, many of whom are fairly well politically connected. Guatemala is a little more surprising, because I would have thought they would be more subject to American influence. But apparently they somehow evaded these concessions. Ecuador and El Salvador, however, did not. So Ecuador agreed to remove or lower tariffs on products including machinery, health products, chemicals, motor vehicles. El Salvador agreed to provide preferential market access for U.S. goods, which effectively is pretty similar to agreeing to remove or lower tariffs, but could also encompass regulations. And the range of goods is, again, pharmaceutical products, medical devices, interestingly, remanufactured goods, and motor vehicles. So a somewhat more expansive, definite range of goods that would be subject here. So the thing here is that El Salvador and Ecuador don't have large industrial bases. And so agreeing to open up their market to imports of American machinery and other finished goods That's not that big a concession. That'll mostly benefit consumers in the form of lower prices and will not really disrupt any significant political or economic actors. There may be some small ones that are put out, but otherwise, I don't think this will make big waves in these places. Now, if you're wondering why Guatemala then would not agree to do this if it's not that big a deal, since Guatemala is pretty similar in not having a big industrial base, keep in mind a lot of small countries still harbor ambitions to develop their own industry, and that many of them maintain varying degrees of tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade in order to try to incentivize infant industries to emerge that could pave the way to significant development in new industries. Doesn't generally work for a variety of reasons, but they still try. And so I suspect that's why Guatemala did not agree to do this. So let's see. Another one, this is the final category for Latin American concessions in these trade deals. China actually made their way into these negotiations. Specifically, the US government here is trying to push partner countries into agreeing to a kind of common economic front, basically to try to contain economic influence by limiting exposure to Chinese trade. Specifically Chinese trade in very specific goods, generally electronics, telecommunications, increasingly green tech type stuff, electric vehicles, batteries, what have you. Nominally on national security grounds, sometimes on anti-dumping grounds, the excuses vary. But basically Washington wants partner countries to try to restrict trade with China in the same way that the United States is, so that American producers can have an even playing field to play on, so they're not having to compete in other countries directly with Chinese producers that enjoy an unfair advantage in the form of state subsidies of various kinds. Success on this front has been very hit or miss for Washington. They haven't been very impactful in doing this. Most countries prefer to maintain trade with China because it's so lucrative. And Washington hasn't really given a good combination of either incentives or disincentives to do otherwise, to really change how other countries do that. That is to say, deal with China. But in these agreements, the American government has given an example of how they're trying to create some incentives. So for one, Argentina, for its part, agreed to treat U.S. firms fairly in its critical minerals sector and to adopt a ban on the importation of goods produced by forced or compulsory labor. That last one is the important one that's going to pop up again here. The critical minerals thing we've talked about before, the Trump administration, and to a lesser degree the Biden administration prioritizing creating a critical minerals supply chain that does not include China, so that the United States can have a secure supply of those materials, which presently it disproportionately imports from China, which gives China leverage in not only trade negotiations, but also just international negotiations generally. So no surprise that critical minerals are mentioned here. Argentina is also a major producer of critical minerals, specifically lithium. It's in something called the lithium triangle, I believe is what it's called, which is one of the densest deposits of rich deposits of lithium on the planet. So lithium frequently comes up in Argentine trade negotiations, not only with the United States, but also with China, actually. In fact, I think Chinese companies are mostly exploiting them, technically, at the moment. The ban on the importation of goods produced by forced or compulsory labor, I'll get to that more in a minute. Ecuador agreed to ban the importation of goods produced by forced or compulsory labor, same thing again. They also agreed to strengthen their economic and national security cooperation with the United States by taking complementary actions to address non-market policies and cooperating on investment security and export controls. So basically, this is the Ecuadorian government promising to deal with China in a way that is more like how the United States does it. So China is the country being referenced here. There's not really any other country on the planet with non-market policies, i.e. state-owned enterprises, subsidies, industrial policy, etc., that is sufficiently disruptive to global trade to warrant attention from Washington. So Ecuador here is being made to, if not copy, then at least emulate American trade restrictions on China. The details are not really mentioned; they're fuzzy. This is again a framework agreement. So the final agreement may be different, but nominally, the fact that Washington got them to promise this at all, that Washington even brought it up, illustrates that this is something Washington cares about, and this could be a kind of template for how Washington approaches this in future trade negotiations with other countries. Cooperating on investment security and export controls is interesting to me. The United States over the past 15 years has created a whole trade regime, regulatory regime rather, that has significantly increased the oversight of foreign investment into the United States. It focuses almost exclusively on Chinese investment into the United States, but that regulatory apparatus overseeing that investment was effectively non-existent 15 some years ago. So that's a significant change, and it seems Washington wants other countries to do something similar vis-a-vis Chinese investment. El Salvador, kind of a vague promise to strengthen economic and national security cooperation. Specifically, they want to enhance supply chain resilience, innovation, and collaboration on duty evasion. Basically, that's a synonym for tariff evasion, procurement, investment security, and export controls. Investment security and export controls, same thing as what Ecuador did. Collaboration on tariff evasion is notable. One of the things that both the Biden and Trump administrations tried to do was to create a kind of common front on tariffs, specifically regarding re-exports, which we've talked about before. So the idea is that if the United States creates high tariffs on Chinese goods because they're engaging in dumping or they're a national security threat or whatever, then Chinese manufacturers can get around those tariffs by exporting those goods to a third-party country where local entities can then export those goods on into the United States. So Washington obviously doesn't particularly like that, and so intermittently they've been trying to pressure different countries into stopping that by implementing tariffs of their own or by accepting American tariffs on the export of those particular items into the United States, specifically on the third-party exporter. So the fact that El Salvador would agree to collaborate on that suggests that the Trump administration has been somewhat successful, at least, in getting another country to actually do that in practice, which has not been the case up until now. Other countries have been very reluctant to do that because the re-export trade is very lucrative. Okay, so El Salvador didn't really agree to the barring importation of goods that were made by slave labor. But I suspect that probably is in the agreement because it's in basically all of the other ones. Now, for those of you who don't know, some years ago, the United States passed a law. Let me see if I can find it here. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. And that was a law that was designed to prevent the import of mostly cotton, which is a major export item for Xinjiang, but also just any good that's made basically in Xinjiang or with forced labor generally. But the target was Xinjiang, because if you're not familiar with that issue, that's a whole thing. But most of the ethnic Uyghur population has been put in camps of various kinds, and as part of their re-education, basically part of a forced campaign of involuntary assimilation into Chinese culture, such as it is, Han Chinese culture specifically. As part of that regime that they have been forced to participate in within the camps, they have to engage in forced labor. And that in turn has been exploited by this, that, or the other firm, corporation, etc., within China in order to benefit from relatively cheap labor. You can imagine that forced labor is pretty cheap. I think the government does extract some value for it. So it's not actually fully free for the companies or firms that benefit from it. But it's cheaper than actually having to pay fair market wages, for sure. So the US government wanted to do something about this, and so they passed this law, which barred import of goods that were made in this way. But it also had the intended side effect of creating a trade barrier for Chinese goods. Both the Biden and Trump administrations have been quite enthusiastic about finding new ways to inhibit the flow of Chinese goods into the United States. And this was a good one because it had good justification. You know, the Uyghur issue is a significant violation of human rights, and it warrants some action on the part of, you know, the global community, not even just the US government. So the US government got to have its cake and eat it too. It got to create a new trade barrier, and it got to do it in a way that protected, or at least nominally seemed to protect, human rights in China. And because that is nominally a good cause, I think the Washington has found it a little easier to get other countries to try to adapt that, specifically in these agreements. I think this is the first time I've seen Washington effectively try to internationalize the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. That is to say, to get other countries to implement a similar provision. But I think because it has to do with human rights, it's a little easier to get those countries to agree to do it, even though it is, in effect, a way to inhibit the flow of Chinese goods. To get into that a little more, you know, so as to not, you know, confuse people, the act does not just impact imports from China that were made using Uyghur labor. It actually imports a lot more goods than that. And the reason is that when you import goods from China, you have to provide documentation proving that it was not made using forced labor. Basically, the US government has a short list of countries where there is forced labor. If you're not importing from one of them, you don't really have to worry about this, but if you are, then you have to get the documentation. And of course, China is the main country on that list. Now, getting that documentation is a problem because the Chinese government, both through laws that it's written as well as through informal pressure that the Communist Party applies on local government and on corporate entities, has actually made it pretty difficult to get documentation of most any kind in China. You know, even just things like government-issued statistics have become relatively difficult to get in China because the government doesn't really like the idea of foreign actors getting a hold of that information. Now, the unintended side effect of that is that it's made it relatively difficult for foreign firms to get documentation that is needed in their own countries to adhere to this, that, or the other regulation. A lot of them are able to overcome that, you know, through a combination of just waiting it out. You know, sometimes it just takes longer to get the necessary paperwork, and also cozying up to, you know, local governments by bribing them or engaging in joint projects or what have you. You know, basically influence peddling. You know, so there are ways around it. But sometimes you just can't get it. And in those cases, you're basically locked out of the US market. And so that's what I mean when I say it impacts goods beyond just those produced in Xinjiang. There's a whole range of goods that have had their access to the US market significantly inhibited because their buyers just can't get the necessary documentation within China. So if other countries were to take this approach, it would have an impact well beyond just manufacturers located within Xinjiang. It would actually have impacts that go well beyond that, you know, into the rest of China. So that's why Washington wants to do it. It's nominally in these agreements. Whether or not these governments actually enforce that, we'll see. Again, lack of administrative capacity, corruption, etc. But it seems that this is how Washington wants to pursue China here, how they want to contain Chinese economic influence. This style of agreement where the Uyghur Protection Act, for one, is basically internationalized, and then also other states kind of adhere to American approaches to reviewing Chinese investment and also emulate American export controls, and also have a common approach to dealing with Chinese re-export markets. These are the strategies, it seems, that Washington wants to use here. I don't know that they'll work because, again, Besides the corruption and lack of administrative capacity in partner countries, there's also the fact that China is just a very attractive trade partner. And they can very credibly say that, they can't alienate China too much without negatively impacting the trading relationship. So to a degree, these countries can actually play Washington and Beijing off of each other, using threats from one in order to counteract demands from the other. So that concludes the concessions from Latin American countries in these agreements. What about some US concessions? They're relatively skimpy, but they did provide some in order to give an incentive to progress with the talks. For one, they offered lower tariffs on food, coffee, etc. I found this one a little bit goofy because the administration then issued an executive order basically doing this for the whole world. So broadly speaking, American tariffs on imports of a whole range of food, coffee, etc. I kind of went through the list last time. That's basically been lifted for the whole planet. So that's not really then a concession then in a given trade negotiation with another country if you're going to do it for everybody and not just them. So I don't really count that as a concession.
If the U.S. is giving skimpy concessions, is that like you need to wear skimpy swimwear or something?
No.
Okay.
No, I'm afraid not. You'll have to go without your skimpy, scantily clad Latinas, I'm afraid.
I see.
So there were some concessions given on an individual bilateral basis. So the first one here, Argentina. The U.S. will remove tariffs on certain unavailable natural resources, that's basically the food, but also non-patented articles for use in pharmaceutical applications. So that's a little bit of ambiguous wording. I'm not entirely sure what was meant by that, but I infer that they're saying that tariffs on generic pharmaceutical, that is to say generic drugs produced in Argentina, will be lifted. Or not lifted, reduced rather. So basically, the Trump administration is saying, if Argentina plays ball here, we will grant greater access to the U.S. market to Argentine pharmaceutical producers of generics, obviously not brand name drugs, but generics. And that is a substantive concession. It's not going to piss off anybody in the United States. Obviously, we benefit from cheaper drugs. And I don't think there's a whole lot of generic producers in the U.S. anyway, because it's just the cost of production here is too high for that. But for Argentina, it's very beneficial because that is a potential growth market for them. Their cost of production is relatively low. Their human capital is relatively high, which is necessary for a lot of pharmaceutical production. So if they could get access to a big market, their pharmaceutical industry could benefit, and that could be very good for the overall economy. I don't think the pharmaceutical industry in any country is really going to be enough to become a significant economic driver, but it is beneficial, and Argentina needs all the exports it can get. So that is a substantive concession there that benefits Argentina. Ecuador is a little more unclear. I'm still not even now entirely sure what Ecuador is really going to get out of this. So the U.S. will remove tariffs on certain qualifying exports from Ecuador that cannot basically be made in the United States. I think the critical word here is mined. So to read the whole thing here, the U.S. will remove its tariffs on certain qualifying exports from Ecuador that cannot be grown, mined, or naturally produced in the United States in sufficient quantities. Now, coffee, food, other stuff like that, that's kind of covered by grown or naturally produced. That basically ties in with the executive order. So like I said, that's not a real concession. But the word mined is interesting here because that implies that there's some mineral that Ecuador exports that could receive greater access to U.S. markets. My issue here is that I don't know what that would be because I don't think there's a lot of mining in Ecuador. The only material that's extracted in Ecuador that is exported in significant quantities that I'm aware of is oil. And that's not really mining per se, just extraction broadly speaking. In so much as there is something to mine, though, Maybe they can mine more of it, make more money. I don't think it's going to be a major economic driver, just because I don't think mining is a big deal in Ecuador in general. But whatever they're producing could get a little boost here. But that's a relatively minor concession for the United States. I don't think that's all of that much benefit to Ecuador there. El Salvador, the United States is going to extend preferences to qualifying CAFTA-DR textiles. So if you don't know what CAFTA-DR is, that's basically I think it's Central American Free Trade Agreement, Dominican Republic. It was originally just CAFTA, and the Dominican Republic became a signatory later on after the agreement was implemented. And so they renamed the agreement CAFTA-DR to reflect the fact that the Dominican Republic was added to it. So this was a big trade agreement that was negotiated between the United States and a number of Central American states, and obviously the Dominican Republic. And mostly it covers a range of goods, but the good that's benefited the most from the free trade area that resulted has been textiles. The textiles industry in Central America has improved, maybe not boomed, that's probably saying too much, but there has been significant investment in it in the region. And it has been a significant driver of improvements in employment, economic growth, tax revenue, etc. So El Salvador here is going to get preferences to certain textiles that qualify under CAFTA. Now, in so much as El Salvador has a textiles industry that's an important driver of, again, economic growth, jobs, etc., that's a notable substantive concession on the part of the United States. However, I would point out that it's also technically illegal. The CAFTA agreement was a treaty that was signed by the United States, and by law in the United States, treaties are equivalent to law. When you sign the treaty and ratify it, that becomes codified. You have to respect that. And the Trump administration is very much not doing that right now, not only with regard to its reciprocal tariffs that were imposed on Central American states, but with this agreement in particular. If they actually did go through with this, that would be in breach of the agreement, which would be illegal, and which the federal government of the United States would have to reverse at some point, pending a lawsuit, which presumably would come almost inevitably. So notable substantive concession on the part of Washington here, but also one that they can't entirely credibly make. Guatemala will see the United States remove reciprocal tariffs on certain Guatemalan exports. This includes, again, foodstuffs, whatnot, et cetera, but also qualifying textiles and apparel. So this is a similar deal with El Salvador. The textiles industry is a nascent but growing industry in Guatemala. If they can get preferential access to the United States, that would be very beneficial to them in that industry. However, the same problem as with El Salvador applies, which is that it's illegal. Washington can't do that. So the United States did give them something. They did have a reason to give up their various concessions, but it's not always a whole lot, especially in the case of Ecuador. So those are the agreements in detail. I can get into a little bit of a critique here. Limited American concessions, already discussed that. The agreements are not binding, like I discussed earlier. These are just framework agreements. They're subject to change in the future. In the case of Central America, they're illegal, just mentioned that. Okay, so this is an important one. 3 of the 4 Latin American countries discussed here have governments that are uniquely favorable to Washington. It's important to point out here that these are not the only 4 countries that Washington negotiated with. Washington has been attempting to negotiate deals like this with a whole range of countries. Supposedly, they're relatively close to a deal with Brazil, and Trump has also mentioned, the Trump administration anyway, has also mentioned Taiwan as a country they're negotiating a deal like this with. But these are the only 4 that have actually moved forward into the reached a framework agreement phase, whatever you want to call that. And the leaders of those countries are notable in that they have relatively close personal relationships with Trump or want them. So specifically, the three in question are Milei in Argentina. Obviously, he's on good personal terms with Trump to the point where he got Trump to spend 40 some, well, actually 20 billion some dollars, helping him out ahead of a recent election in Argentina. So, in that sense, maybe not that surprising that the Argentine government is relatively amenable to American demands. Their leaders have relatively close ties. And Milei himself, I would point out as an addendum here, is already pretty predisposed towards free trade anyway. He's famously libertarian in his public policy preferences. So the Trump administration asking him to do stuff that he wanted to do anyway, not that big a deal. No surprise that Milei was on board with that. In El Salvador, President Bukele is a populist, the so-called self-described even coolest dictator in the world. So he personally has good ties with Trump in that he has been very willing and amenable to the Trump administration's demands to repatriate not only deported immigrants that originally came from El Salvador, but also those that came from other countries. El Salvador has basically been holding some of those deportees in lieu of deportation to their country of origin, which sometimes just can't happen right away. And of course, there was the whole brouhaha about American citizens being illegally deported to El Salvador's supermax prisons. Bukele obviously won some brownie points for the Trump administration for playing ball on that as well. So given that Bukele has that close personal relationship, maybe not a surprise then that he's been willing to give some more concessions in order to maintain that good personal relationship, which presumably comes with some, probably what are currently unknown perks for Bukele. The third one here is the president of Ecuador, Mr. Noboa. And he's interesting in that he does not really currently have a close relationship with Trump or the Trump administration, but he's been trying to make one. He's actually gone out of his way for much of the past 2 years. Well, I guess the past year specifically, since he's been in office roughly that long, to try to signal to the Trump administration that he wants to work with them, that he's amenable to American interests in Latin America, and that he's willing to give concessions if it means building that relationship with the United States. Some of that is just his politics. He's a conservative president who's trying to take the country in a different direction than the one it had been on. Ecuador had been a country led by Chavistas for a long time. And the Chavistas in Ecuador, as in the rest of Latin America, were very hostile to the United States and to its interests in the region. And so correspondingly, they did things like kick the United States out from a major military base that it had in Ecuador, ended cooperation on drugs and other security issues, and also pulled out of the Rio Treaty, which is a regional defense agreement that the United States maintains with most of Latin America. The exceptions being notably the Chavista-run states in the region, Ecuador among them at one point. Now, since the Chavistas have lost power with the onset of a conservative presidency, although they still maintain a pretty strong presence in the legislature, Noboa has tried to reverse some of the changes that had been implemented by the previous Chavista government, among them distancing Ecuador from the United States. Noboa wants closer relations, and so he's teased allowing the United States to return to its base, resuming security cooperation, resuming defense procurement from the United States, just a whole range of stuff, basically. But he's also gone out of his way to signal that he would be willing to play ball on things like Trump's immigration agenda by housing immigrants temporarily while they're being processed and eventually deported to their country of origin. Among other things, this is just the stuff I'm remembering off the top of my head. So basically, Noboa really wants that close relationship, but has been at pains to get Trump's attention. It's kind of a one-way street. So unfortunately for Noboa, the relationship has not quite blossomed yet, but he's on his way. And this agreement could be one of the ways that Noboa and the Ecuadorian government is signaling to Washington that it kind of wants to be on their side. Now, beyond just shifting the country's foreign policy away from the Chavista approach to foreign policy, there's also the fact that Noboa himself may be somewhat corrupt and may be looking for a partner in order to kind of protect him and his party and his more accurately, his patronage network within Ecuador. That wouldn't really surprise me either. There's no shortage of corruption in Ecuador's politics. But I don't want to just say corruption right off the bat. There are some genuine preferences at play, kind of powering this move by Noboa. So another fun item here about these agreements, specifically vis-a-vis Argentina. Argentina is a part of a regional trade agreement called Mercosur. And Mercosur rules require all member states to agree on external trade deals. You can't just kind of run off and do a bilateral trade deal without notifying your Mercosur partners. So technically, this agreement, such as it is with the Trump administration, if it were to actually go forward and be ratified, would be illegal according to Argentina's treaty with Mercosur member states. So Argentina then may face a difficult choice between honoring the agreement with the United States or staying in Mercosur, since presumably member states would not tolerate Argentina breaking the rules like this. However, I would point out, like I said before, this is a framework agreement. There's a very good chance this just doesn't really go anywhere, or if it does, that the agreement is significantly watered down to the point where Argentina's Mercosur member states would not really have a problem with them moving forward with it. If push comes to shove and they really have to choose between leaving Mercosur and honoring the agreement with the Trump administration, I would guess that Buenos Aires would almost certainly choose Mercosur. It's an established institution. It provides tangible benefits to the Argentine economy. It's an important linchpin of international diplomacy in the region, in that it gives states in the region incentive to maintain peaceful relations, since there are, some residual points of tension. The Trump agreement, by contrast, is mercurial. You don't know the details. The Trump administration has a track record of breaking its own agreements. And also, there's very good reason to believe the whole Trump trade regime will not survive the Trump administration in future. So all told, given the choice, you kind of got to go with Mercosur. Let's see, and I think I pretty much got the rest here already. Yeah, I kind of discussed it while we were moving through the concessions. Oh, regarding China, one point here. Beijing probably won't actually care too much if these countries do go forward with the provisions in the agreement that target trade with China, because even if they were implemented, it wouldn't be all that disruptive. It's not hard to circumvent export restrictions or restrictions on goods that are made with forced labor. Chinese companies have found it relatively easy to get around those. So even if these provisions were enforced, or the governments in question attempted to enforce them anyway, they would probably meet with fairly mixed success. So I don't think China is going to be particularly threatened by any of these agreements. So hopefully that provides a better look at the agreements than I was able to provide last time. To more directly answer Dagnip's question, I don't think the sovereignty of the Latin American participants in these negotiations would be substantively violated if they were to move forward with them. Nor do I think that their interests, so to speak, have necessarily been hurt. I think the provisions that are concessions on their part, that increase access to their markets for certain American industries, would not be very disruptive. I don't think it's a big deal. And I would include Argentina in that in particular. I don't think Argentina opening up to American beef is going to be that big a deal in the grand scheme of things, for the aforementioned reasons. And I would point out that Trump and his administration do deserve some credit here, because one of the things that has been the objective of multiple presidential administrations for decades now has been to negotiate broader trade agreements, both bilaterally and globally, that involve greater regulatory alignment, basically more efforts to address and reduce non-tariff barriers to trade. And progress has been pretty much zero for much of the past 20 years on that count. So the Trump administration does deserve some credit for, one, making it a priority, and two, actually getting partner states to at least nominally and preliminarily agree to do so. We'll see whether or not it sticks. That's kind of been the knock against the Trump administration's trade strategies. They make short-term gains. They make short-term gains that very frequently end up being ephemeral. They end up being nominally agreed to, but then never actually followed up on, or if they're followed up on, implementation is weak to the point where it doesn't even really matter. There's all manner of barriers that eventually come up, and the Trump administration itself very frequently loses focus and stops caring, which can result in these agreements kind of falling by the wayside.
Well, it seems like a lot of the agreements are meant to set a tone or take a stance with an entity rather than to explicitly achieve some desired result. It's kind of like letting people know that you can throw your weight around by applying pressure. And then as soon as something changes as a result of the pressure, they count it as a victory.
That seems to be the Trump administration's MO. I would agree. It can shake loose some concessions, but again, they don't generally last. And they very frequently can end up being so full of holes that they're not even real concessions. Kind of like how a lot of the concessions I discussed here basically are constructed. When did we start? 11:15?
2 hours ago.
Wow. It can take a while to get through the more detailed stuff. Hopefully not too boring for people. I'll throw out the usual disclaimer before I forget again, like last time. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I have more of a background in foreign policy and economics. So if I ever say anything's wrong, stupid, or biased, please let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. I don't reach out while we do this, but I will see it later. So participation is encouraged, and we do enjoy the feedback we get on here. I always learn something every time I go through the video logs.
Thanks, chat. I did see chat mention that Australia had a major election recently, and it was a landslide victory.
Did they?
Mm-hmm.
Man, if it did, it went completely under my radar. I think they had an election like a year ago. You sure this isn't a state election?
Well, no.
Oh, no, not a year. Okay, May 25. Yeah, I do remember they had the national election, and it was the Labour candidate that won, although not by much. Yeah, I remember, what was his name? I'm looking at it here, Peter Dutton. He was kind of a Trumpy type guy, sort of a populist conservative. And the election was relatively close, I think, if I remember correctly. But I don't remember it being like a huge win for Labour. So unless they're talking about a different election, then yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add. We've discussed it before, basically. I don't think the Labour government can really do a whole lot different. And I don't think they've even really done all that much in the, past 6 months to a year that they've been in power. Or at least if they have, I haven't read about it, which would not surprise me. My news sources don't focus a lot on Australian politics. And Australian politics is still kind of a mystery to me. I'm not super familiar on the history of it, which makes it hard to analyze. Yeah, Australia is one of those countries that, if you're an American, feels very familiar. You feel like you know about it. But then the more you think about it, the more you realize you really just don't know shit about it. Like the political history, the cultural history, all of that kind of stuff. Like, that's really not well discussed here in the United States. It's not something we ever really read about or learn.
Well, we're children of the same monarchy. America's, or the U.S. is maybe more of a melting pot by a bit, but Australia is also a melting pot in its own way.
I mean, pretty much all Anglo-Saxon countries are. They all have the same approach. They call it different things, but it's basically the same thing. It plays out the same way in all of them. Canada likes to pretend that they have a cultural mosaic, as they call it. They don't like the idea of a melting pot because that implies people losing their culture. That culture adjusting into something else. Cultural mosaic implies that you get to keep your culture, and so long as that you kind of play nice with everybody else. This is basically bullshit. It's feel-good bullshit. It's a nice sentiment, but the reality is that Canadian assimilation works the same way as American assimilation. Realistically, after the second or third generation of immigrants, you're basically losing your culture and assimilating into the dominant Anglo culture in either Canada or the United States. So props to Canada for trying, but it's not happening. It's just too difficult to maintain a distinct culture when you're completely immersed in another one like that, and where all of the opportunities de facto require you to assimilate. Like if you want higher education, technical expertise, business opportunities, you got to speak English. Like that's just a must. In a lot of states here in the United States, it's not an official language, but it doesn't have to be. Like people just assimilate naturally because that's where the opportunities are. And invariably, if you're a kid growing up in the United States or Canada, you're going to be around a lot of other kids who are Anglos of one kind or another, or if they're not Anglos, or Anglo assimilated, such that they speak English and have Anglo type cultural preferences and cultural touchstones of one kind or another. And if you grow up in an environment like that, like invariably, you kind of want to assimilate because you want to get along with people. If you talk with people, you're going to talk about those cultural references that are just already dominant in whatever country you're in. And so invariably, you're going to gravitate towards those. It's very, very difficult to kind of hang on to your parents or especially your grandparents' culture as a second or third generation immigrant when you're growing up in the new country like that. I've even heard firsthand, like just people at the grocery store talking amongst themselves about how difficult it is to get their kids to learn their mother language. A lot of Spanish speakers who come to the United States from Mexico talk about how it kind of hurts them that their kids, and especially their grandkids, can't talk to a lot of their relatives in Mexico because they just refuse to learn Spanish. They just won't do it. They grow up speaking English in school with their friends online, and so Spanish just isn't necessarily all that useful to them. So unless you really pin them down and basically make them do it, they probably won't. And even if you do make them do it, they're not going to be as proficient as you are, the parent, or certainly as a native speaker, back in the mother country. So assimilation is pretty much inevitable. The United States, Canada, Australia, all of the Anglo-Saxon countries are really good at that. To a degree, every country is. It's kind of the same process everywhere, but in the United States in particular, and the other Anglo-Saxon countries, we've developed a particular talent for it because we have civic nationalism instead of ethnic nationalism. This idea that we're an ethnic group that's lived on this land since time immemorial, and we have blood ties that kind of tie us together beyond just common national identity. We basically can't have that in the United States because we haven't been here since time immemorial. We've only really been here for like 200 years. And most of us haven't even been here that long. Most of us have family lineages that only go back maybe 100 years or so. So civic nationalism is very much the order of the day here in places like the United States, Canada, etc. And that actually improves assimilation. It helps it along, because it makes it much easier to become part of the group. We don't require you to be a blood relative of, some random dude who was farming here 1,000 years ago. You can totally just come here from somewhere else. And, so long as you respect democracy and like Star Wars, You fit in. Easy.
Yeah.
Very low barrier to entry in the grand scheme of things. And while that might sound dangerous in so much as it means lots of people with different values can come here, in effect, after 2 or 3 generations, they have the same values. It's really not that big a deal. So I'm very much not of the immigrant hawk mindset on this. I think that they've kind of got the wrong idea in a lot of ways about it. But it also means that the Canadian notion of cultural mosaic is kind of bullshit. They are sort of lying to themselves a little bit about how that really works in
They're
practice.
making it sound nice.
Yeah. But Australia is definitely part of that family, and they, like the other Anglo Saxon countries, have been very successful at assimilating new people in. There's a huge chunk of the population now that has Asian descendant, that is of Asian descent. And, near as I can tell, they haven't had any problems. Doesn't seem to be an issue. And it's all the more remarkable if you look at the Anglo Saxon countries as a whole, because all of them, as individual states, have received large numbers of immigrants from very different parts of the world. The UK and Canada, for example, get a lot from South Asia. The United States gets a lot from Latin America. Australia gets a lot from Asia. And despite all these different places being so different, Asia, Latin America, South Asia, the results have been pretty much the same, regardless of country. So that's a pretty strong track record. Assimilation is just very, very powerful in these societies. Not sure how I got onto that. A prolonged tangent.
We love those. We started with the discussion about a Australian election, if there was one.
Oh, right. Yeah, the only one I can think of is the national election earlier this year. I don't have a whole lot to add about it. Labor won, not by much, and hasn't really been able to do a whole lot. That's kind of the story of a lot of centrist-type political parties over the past couple decades. They're seen as a better alternative than the more radical populists, but a lot of the problems people most want the government to solve basically are unsolvable, or at least are not solvable in a way that's especially satisfying. So things like deindustrialization, structural economic change that favors capital over labor. These are big, big structural forces that governments are not really well positioned to deal with in a way that's especially satisfying, which is why we've seen such swings in Western politics over the past couple decades. The centrist establishment parties discredited themselves by their inability to deal with these kinds of problems. Populists sweep in. They fail to deal with the problems because they're generally even less capable of dealing with them. So then they get voted out, the establishment comes back in, but then they still can't deal with the problems, and then so people go back to the populists, and so on and so on. Really, you would just have to get the broader part of the voting public to understand that what they're asking for basically just can't be delivered. That we're just going to go through a very long, difficult transition period until we can get to a new equilibria. But that's asking a bit much. A lot of people just kind of want to live their lives, do the 9 to 5, get by. All they see is the hard stuff, the difficulties they face, and that's how they judge politicians. That's not great, but it does come with some benefits. So long as people keep their preferences simple, it can be harder to screw them over. It's harder to fool them. The more elaborate the requirements that voters make and have, the easier it is to bullshit them. But if all you really care about is inflation, employment, etc., stuff like that is kind of hard to bullshit. If you're having a hard time, you're having a hard time. If stuff is getting more expensive, the government's not really going to be able to hide that without significant effort and significant subsidies. And of course, if you're unemployed, then yeah, you're especially upset. So that's the trade-off you make in having simple voters. It's probably worth it in the grand scheme of things, even if it can produce very frustrating results at times.
Was there any developments in the tension between the U.S. and Venezuela? I know we were shooting at boats or something.
Yeah, there's been a tiff about airspace. I still don't think it's going anywhere. I think this is bordering on kayfabe. I think the Trump administration is trying to pressure them, but it's not taking it especially seriously. So at this point, it's just turning into theater. Let me see if I can. What did I do with it? Oh, here we go. So there were some airlines that had suspended their flights over Venezuela, to and from Venezuela, over the American military buildup. And Venezuelan government responded by saying that if they did not resume flights, then they would ban those airlines from flying to Venezuela at all. Now, the flights did not resume, and so the bans actually went through. And that led the Trump administration to start threatening the Venezuelan government that if they didn't lift the ban, then they were going to close Venezuelan airspace.
Whoa.
And I think a day or two later, they declared that Venezuelan airspace was effectively closed, crediting their own military buildup for doing so. But I haven't seen the Trump administration say more than that on the airspace topic. They have sent more signals that they're about, quote unquote, to start bombing land targets in Venezuela, presumably linked to narco trafficking of one kind or another. But I haven't seen much follow up on that. And I know that the administration's own language on that count tends to be a little bit cagey. They say that they're about to, but they might be willing to talk about it, and they'll do it later rather than sooner, that kind of stuff. So their credibility on this only ever seems to get weaker. I'm still very much of the mind that this is just going to be theater, and the administration will eventually just back off out of boredom. Well, I meant to ask you something, actually.
What's that?
Did you get a chance to see the Aurora Borealis up there in Dakota?
Yes, a little bit.
What was it like?
Well, the place where I could see it, it wasn't like this super vibrant, but you can see it through your phone because it picks up on a few more frequencies that aren't the most visible with the naked eye. It looked like a green glow on the horizon. It was pretty. My brother, he probably got a better view of it than I did because he and his girlfriend went out to a peak that's pretty close by where it was apparently a lot more visible. But a lot of the United States saw it when normally it wouldn't be visible in those regions.
Have you ever seen it before?
No.
First time. Okay.
Yeah.
Must have been pretty cool.
Yes.
We don't get that down here.
The stars at night are big and bright, deep in the heart of Texas.
Yeah, we get, what is it? Ambient something pollution? Light pollution? Whatever it's called.
Yes. Well, you are in Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, so...
Yeah. The sky in Dallas-Fort Worth has light pollution and smog. That's what our sky looks like. Not so much the Aurora Borealis, unfortunately.
It is easier to get things done for more of the year in Texas, though, owing to the heat. Summer sucks, but you can work at night for a lot of things. But then winter is a lot less gnarly than out here in South Dakota.
I should think so. You're basically in a hostile environment up there.
Yes. Almost everything will die if it's outside right now. So you need to specifically be a hibernating animal or have like very secure human shelter with insulation or be very bundled up and not be outside for too long. Because if it's 0 Fahrenheit or below 0 Fahrenheit, it's hours, I think, until you die. Texas, maybe it gets down to snowing temperature a bit, Maybe you get one snow a year if you're in North Texas.
It's more like sleet.
Yeah.
Very, like an actual snow tends to be pretty rare.
Mm.
I think we got snowflakes once, a long time ago. The last time I remember seeing snowflakes in person was when I was a kid, back in the 90s. Yeah, they were coming down real hard. That's the hardest I'd ever seen it.
We got a few snow days in college years. Maybe not at UTD, but at UNT before. I remember very affectionately a day that was going to be our biology exam. It was a Friday. And it snowed enough that they closed the university for the day. So anyone who had the bio exam didn't have it until Monday. And that was really nice. So we just watched movies and chilled. It's like, yes, more time to procrastinate. The best.
Nice. Well, if you don't mind me asking, what kind of heating do you have up there?
For the building that I'm in, which is not the main house of the property, but it's a livable domain, it's a Mitsubishi American Standard unit that's on the wall, kind of next to me. So it's just one smaller unit. It doesn't have central heat or AC.
Gotcha. That's electric, I assume.
Yes.
Gotcha.
In the summer, you can just open the windows and stuff, and that same unit also has cooling. So,
Oh, really?
yeah, pretty sweet. Nice little thing. It's maybe, I'm trying to think of the size, maybe like 4 feet across. 4 by 2 by 1 ish feet.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Such a small little item protecting you from the severe elements just outside your window.
Yes. But I also, as a living, breathing man, generate heat of my own, which stays inside as it's insulated. And there's a small cat as well who does his part. And my PC is on. Plus we have lights. So doing
Nice.
okay.
Well, I'll add an addendum here about the Trump administration's executive order ordering the exemption of a whole variety of foodstuffs and coffee and whatnot from tariffs. This had the unintended side effect of significantly undermining some punitive tariffs that had been implemented earlier. So, for example, India was hit with a big, what was it, like a 50% tariff over importing Russian oil. But one of the big export items from India to the US had been food. And now that's exempt as a result of this new executive order. So that's actually fairly significantly alleviated the pressure on the Indian government and economy that had been applied by that earlier tariff. Correspondingly, it's probably also improved diplomatic relations. That had been a sore point for New Delhi, but now the tariff is so watered down that it's not really an issue. They're still trying to negotiate the removal of the earlier tariff. They would rather not have it than have it, but its overall impact on India's macroeconomy is not that big, especially now. So a fairly significant amount of tariff relief for a number of agricultural exporters around the world, stemming from the XO. How are we doing on time?
I'm going for about 2 hours 20. And as usual, if it's not a super fast week, a crazy week, then you don't need to do the full 3. Based on your energy and enthusiasm.
Yeah, my throat is turning on me. Let's see. What else did we have? Did you see the shooting of the 2 National Guardsmen in Washington?
No.
Oh, well, 2 National Guardsmen were shot in Washington, D.C. It turns out it was an Afghan veteran of the war in Afghanistan who was brought over after the war ended. He had apparently been part of a so called Zero team of basically special forces raiders that worked with the CIA in Afghanistan.
Huh.
He had a relative say that he has a history of some mental illness from his combat experience. Apparently, he'd been living in Washington State, I think it was, and then drove across the country to Washington, D.C., where he shot the 2 guardsmen. Still don't have a motive. Nobody knows. Lots of speculation on the internet, of course. Choose your own adventure. But nobody actually knows why he did it, at least not as of yet. Yeah, his name was Lackenwall. I'm almost certainly mispronouncing that. DHS said that's the Department of Homeland Security, says he entered the U.S. in 2021 under something called Operation Allies Welcome, which was a Biden-era program to resettle thousands of Afghans who assisted the U.S. during the war. The Trump administration says that this guy was only in the country because of the Biden administration's terrible, terrible immigration policy, as they like to frame it. But it's been pointed out that the vetting for this guy was actually done during the current Trump administration. Just a couple months into it, I think it was. Let me see if I can find it. So his application for asylum was approved in December 24 under the Biden administration, and then was approved April 23rd of this year, 3 months into the new Trump administration. So there's been some sniping online about who's responsible and whatnot, as you might expect. The Trump administration, and specifically Trump himself, has used the shooting as an opportunity to grandstand. As you might expect, he said that he's going to ban all immigration from third world countries. Very dramatic. I think that's since been walked back. I think they're reviewing green card immigrants from a specific set of countries, mostly Muslim countries, as I recall, specifically those with issues of instability, terrorism, failed states, that kind of thing. So I suspect they're not really going to do too much about this of substance. I think they did say they might revoke status for a number of Afghans currently living here, but there's been a big outcry about that, so they may back off of that. So there's been some drama about that. I think we already talked about the fire, right? Did we talk about the flooding?
Where?
Asia, basically.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it's been a good week for the climate doomers. There's been massive historic flooding in both Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka.
The climate doomers feel validated. Yes,
Well,
we told you
much.
it was going to be fucked. We said it was. We said it would flood, and it flooded.
There's definitely a lot of flooding. It's been really bad in a lot of these places. I think the death toll rather that I have here is 435 dead in Indonesia, 334 in Sri Lanka, 162 in Thailand, and then 2 in Malaysia.
Damn.
Yeah, I don't have any videos of that, but you can probably guess. Pretty much the same as most flooding.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just been of a scale that's been out of the ordinary.
Mm-hmm.
And so governments in the region have been a little overwhelmed on account of that.
Yeah, because it's going to be flooding beyond the historical parameters of where you would expect, because many countries have a known flooding season where it just rains a shit ton and flooding does occur. But if it's consistently in those areas, then they anticipate it and you build your society around it. But climate change means that those boundaries can change. The amounts can change and so on. Either you get less water or more from what you used to.
Well, would it be acceptable to wrap up a little early today?
Yes, sir.
2.5 hours isn't too bad, right?
That's excellent, dude. You can always take your resa. You give us many, many hours of information, entertainment, knowledge, and things to think about. I'm in a match, but if you want to...
Oh, that's no problem. I've got some dumb, weird news I can talk about.
Ooh, our favorite. Give us the dumb, weird stuff.
Let's see. I've got to find it first. Ah, here we go. So, unfortunately, I regret to inform you that this will require me to talk about child sex dolls.
Gods.
Yeah, it's a weird one. Have you ever heard of Shane or Shine? I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Come to think of it, it's a online Chinese retailer. Jeez.
I've not heard of it.
Yeah, you can just like order stuff, whatever you want, kind of like Amazon or what have you. So they got in trouble recently because it was found. I think the French authorities were the ones to really take a lead on this, and other entities, including U.S. states, have followed up on it. Shane was found to be selling, well, child sex dolls. They were sex dolls shaped like children.
Ugh.
Yeah. So, like I said, the French were the first to get tipped off about this, and they've been prosecuting it. And I think there's been some other retailers, Temu, AliExpress, and Wish, that are also now being investigated. Shane, for its part, had been warned about this by some activists, I think, at one point, a couple months ago. But they said that it was legit and didn't really do anything about it. Since this kind of hit the headlines, they've been much more proactive, as you might expect. They banned the third party involved from their website, as you might expect, and they've also tried to write up some new rules trying to ban this from happening again in future. Some of the other platforms in China have also taken a similar tack to try to make sure that they don't get hammered by this as well. So probably should have been done before. I don't think there's really much reason for anybody to be selling child sex dolls. So it kind of seems like they should have prevented this early on, but you know how it is. A lot of companies around the world just don't pay that much attention. Not necessarily because they don't care so much as they just don't want to spend the money. It's just easier and faster to let things slide without paying too much attention. There's probably been similar cases in the past that were not as egregious as this one, where they just kind of shrugged their shoulders and forgot about it, didn't bother dealing with it. There's no shortage of people, say, in the United States or other developed countries that complain about cheap knockoffs violating their patents. People will invent something and then try to sell it, and then they'll find cheap knockoffs getting sold on sites like Shane or what have you. And they'll complain about it, and they'll pretend to do something about it, but then there's no real follow-up. So that behavior is not unusual. I think they're being much more proactive this time because child sex dolls is obviously much, much more controversial than something like patent or IP protections.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I did have some corrections. Actually, I could do those. So we talked about aircraft carriers a while back.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't quite get the distribution of countries with carriers as opposed to countries with helicopter carriers correct. So Italy actually has full-fledged fleet carriers. They do not just have helicopter carriers, so I got that wrong. India actually has carriers. That was a country that I just missed entirely. Interestingly, they've had carriers for a long time. They actually inherited, I think, one or two carriers from the British when they got independence back in the 40s. So there's basically not been a time since India has been an independent country when they have not had an aircraft carrier. They've also used carriers and naval aviation in all of the wars they've fought with Pakistan. One of the first things they did in the the 65 Indo-Pak War is that they used naval aviation to bomb Pakistani targets in what was then East Pakistan in Bangladesh. Let's see. Another thing I got wrong, Thailand does not have a full fleet carrier. Rather, they have a helicopter carrier. My mistake. And then there was a whole gaggle of countries that have helicopter carriers that I missed. Some of them I didn't even know about. Turkey has them, although I think they're a recent addition, and theirs is kind of half helicopter carrier, half drone carrier. But Turkey does have one. Egypt has one, interestingly. Thailand, as mentioned, has one. South Korea has one. Algeria, weirdly, has one. I don't know what they need one for, but they have one. And then Brazil has one.
Those are the helicopter carrier havers.
Correct. So they have aircraft carriers, but they're much smaller than full fleet carriers, and they're really designed mostly just to handle helicopters and not fixed-wing aircraft. Also, somebody in chat mentioned that Russia doesn't really have one because it might have been scrapped or is in the process of being scrapped, but I tried to Google to follow up on that, and I didn't really find anything. So near as I can tell, they do still have the Kuznetsov. But it's not exactly in working condition at the moment.
And that's a aircraft carrier for planes or a helicopter carrier?
It's a full fleet carrier.
Gotcha. Yeah, those things would be so expensive to keep running, so unless you specifically need to go somewhere to project force or whatever, the US is really the only country who I would guess does that.
Yeah, the Soviets originally intended to build a bunch of them. You know, they were going to try to get a full-fledged blue water navy, but they didn't really start until like the early mid-'80s, maybe. So by the time they kind of reached the point where they were producing the carriers, the Soviet Union collapsed, and I think the Kuznetsov was the only one they actually finished. They had another one that was unfinished that they ended up basically selling to the Chinese. They sold it on condition they would not fit it out and actually turn it into a full carrier. You can probably guess what happened. It is in operational condition as of the moment. Oh yeah, we were talking about the Chilean election a couple weeks ago. So the conservative candidate Cast, who's likely to win the presidency in the runoff election that's pending, I thought I had read that he was the son of a member of Chile's Nazi party. Apparently I misunderstood. His father was a member of the actual Nazi party.
Oh.
My mistake.
Oops. Huh, I hadn't seen the Kuznetsov before.
Yeah, it's got a ramp deck. So instead of launching aircraft using a catapult, like U.S. carriers do, you basically just use the ramp to try to get that upward momentum going.
Yeah, I hadn't seen that before. I thought it looked unique. Anyone who's seen Top Gun, you've at least seen the plane on the carrier. It's pretty sweet technology. You're taking a very heavy, powerful, fast-moving plane and launching it from a very short runway in the middle of the ocean.
Yeah, that's why operators of smaller carriers like, say, the British or the French, they have full fleet carriers, but they're not as big as the U.S. ones. They prefer VTOL fixed-wing aircraft because they have the ability to take off with the engines at an angle that helps generate more lift.
Mm-hmm.
So between that and the ramp, they don't need hardly any room to take off.
It's pretty sweet.
Oh, I should ask, are you familiar with the term VTOL?
Yeah.
Okay.
Vertical takeoff and landing.
Bingo, yeah. I can never tell. Sometimes I'll use technical terms and people will just kind of smile and nod at me. Kind of learn the hard way that I have to explain things.
Corky in chat is saying that the Russians also use a catapult assist along with the ramp, but the ramp allows you to make a shorter vessel.
Huh. Interesting.
But
Today
the US
I
just
learned.
makes them bigger.
Big old fat Ford class carriers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that the range of planes that you would put on the carrier, I think you could fly them across the ocean, but that would expend a lot of their fuel reserves, and it takes a lot of weight for them to carry that. But you basically offload that long-term journey onto the aircraft carrier itself, and then you could potentially harass or do recon in different countries with your planes from the boat.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what military excursions carriers have really gotten major use in, because weren't they something that came at the end of World War II? Like, that was the World War II thing?
Start of World War II. Yeah, because the Japanese obliterated the battleships and other sort of frontline capital ships that the U.S. Navy was planning on using in its fight against the Japanese Navy, and so they had to default to carriers. So carriers ended up becoming the main capital ship for the U.S. Navy as a result of that, and turns out it was really effective. People already knew carriers could be effective, but there were a lot of conservatives and navies around the world that were very reluctant to abandon ships of the line, basically the ships with the big guns. Carriers, to them, were auxiliary ships that provided support to your main capital ships. They resisted strongly the idea that carriers could be capital ships themselves around which navies could be centered. And it basically just took Pearl Harbor to force them to give that up. But yeah, they've been used extensively since World War II. Vietnam, Korea. Yeah, very heavy usage at the time.
Did we have carriers in Pearl Harbor at the time, and they just didn't get destroyed, or we had them somewhere else?
I think they were on maneuvers at the time, so they were not in port. Yeah, the Japanese fully intended to destroy them, because they considered them high-value targets. But just sheer happenstance, U.S. carriers were not in port when the attack happened, and so they escaped unscathed. Yeah, naval aviation provides just extra support, basically. Whenever there's a war, especially if it's a small war, generally what you see is the different branches of the military jockeying to get themselves involved, even if they don't necessarily need to be. Because if you can get involved, you can test equipment, and you also have an excuse to ask for more money, which is an ever-present political battle between the branches and the government itself writ large. So you didn't necessarily need naval aviation in the Korean War, but it was something the Navy wanted and was able to successfully lobby for. It made more sense in Vietnam, I would argue, because you could park the carriers relatively close to the North Vietnamese coastline, and then you could just hit targets wherever. The U.S. had bases in South Vietnam, but they would have had more forewarning for any aircraft that launched from those, because of course they had spies all over South Vietnam. It's a little harder to spy on an aircraft carrier that's just kind of out in the ocean.
The Battle of Midway is a famous battle involving carriers, says Chad. Is there a
I'm aware.
Is there a movie about that?
Fuck yeah, there's a recent one. I still haven't watched it, actually. It's on my to-do list.
What's the name of that?
It's literally just called Midway.
It's called Midway. Okay.
Yeah, that's the name. They just called it Midway.
Easy to find.
You won't have to look far.
2019. Huh. I don't think I saw this. Roland Emmerich directed.
Yeah, we've talked about the Battle of Midway when we did the Pacific Theater thing.
Yes, it's been years now, though.
Has it?
Yeah.
When did we do that?
Pacific Theater? I feel like we did that during COVID, no?
Oh, wow, did we?
Yeah.
Gosh. 5 years ago. Good
YouTubers, if you're lurking the playlist or something, you could correct us on that, but it's been a while ago.
Oh, yeah, the Battle of Midway was one of the decisive engagements of World War II.
Mm-hmm.
Shifted momentum in the Pacific Theater entirely from the Japanese to the Allies. Effectively destroyed the Imperial Japanese fleet, such as it was at the time. The Japanese had, 4 fleet carriers in the task force that they were using. They were attacking Midway. Mm-hmm. Nominally, they had plans possibly to move on Hawaii, but I think Midway was the main target. And because of basically intelligence, code breaking, what have you, the U.S. Navy figured out that Midway was the target, and so they pre-positioned their own forces to try to ambush them. But the United States at that time had, I think, only 3 carriers, and one of them had just gotten shot up in the Battle of the Coral Sea. And one of the remarkable advantages the United States Navy had over the Japanese is that they were much better at damage control during battle and at repair afterwards. The U.S. industrial base was just way stronger. And so as a result, even though this one carrier got shot up in the Battle of the Coral Sea, the U.S. Navy was able to turn it around and get it back in action fast enough for the Battle of Midway, which shocked the Japanese. They didn't think it would be possible for that carrier to be back in action so soon. Over the course of the battle, long story short, the Japanese lost all 4 of their carriers, 100% casualty rate.
Yeah, and replenishing those is not going to be a quick process.
Yeah, Japanese industry was not up to snuff. It was not comparable to the U.S. So when they lost a capital ship, they basically lost it for the whole war. There were no real replacements that they could expect. Didn't stop them from trying, but it just didn't work. It was a near-run thing. The U.S. Navy did not do as well as it would have liked in that battle. The decisive result kind of belies how close the battle actually was, for the most part, over the course of it. Mm-hmm. The U.S. did successfully ambush the Japanese fleet, but the trouble was that almost all of the aircraft that were sent to do so ended up getting shot down, mostly by Japanese fighters, partly by anti-aircraft guns. Some aircraft were able to get through. The U.S. attacked with a combination of dive bombers and torpedo planes. The trouble is that at that stage of the war, American torpedoes were absolutely hot garbage and basically never worked. So even if they managed to hit a target with them, they wouldn't go off. Like, they were just that bad.
No.
So mostly the work fell to the dive bombers, and just none of them got through. In the first, I think, 2 waves. I think it was 2 whole waves of American aircraft that came in and were just obliterated and weren't able to even make a dent on the Japanese Navy. But as it happens, there was a 3rd wave that got lost on the way to the Japanese fleet. And that delay was critical because when they finally did find the Japanese fleet, they just happened to arrive right when the Japanese aircraft were refueling on their carriers. And so they didn't have that same fighter screen up to defend the fleet, and the result is that the dive bombers were able to get through and hit their targets. And that didn't really happen until near the end of the battle, and it was like the last wave of aircraft the U.S. Navy had. So at the last possible moment, the last aircraft they had just happened to attack at just the right time, and just happened to be very successful in attacking all 4 fleet carriers.
Wait, one aircraft attacked all 4?
Not one aircraft, one wing of aircraft, basically.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
So one group.
Mm-hmm.
There were, I think, 3 separate American groups that attacked at different times. The first 2 attacked relatively in close proximity, one after the other.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a big gap between the second and the third. And the Japanese probably figured, they're done, or they haven't found us again yet. So let's take the opportunity to rearm, refuel. And then that's when the new wing attacked and dived on the Japanese carriers. So very close, but it all worked out in the end. Very luckily for the U.S. Navy.
For real. It seems like battles of that scale haven't occurred since then.
Naval battles? No. Certainly none that I would be aware of.
Is Midway the biggest naval battle that's ever occurred?
By what metric? Like just in terms of the number of ships, or?
I wouldn't go with number of ships, because that could include, like, small paddled vessels, historically. Yeah, you could do tonnage.
Tonnage?
Yeah, just the mass involved.
By tonnage? I would have to guess. I don't know off the top of my head, but it's probably the Battle of Jutland. I don't know if you remember that or not. That was in World War One. Yeah, in World War One, the British Navy blockaded the German coast to prevent them from getting supplies or exporting stuff to fuel their economy. And the Germans had actually built up a very large navy in the lead up to World War One. That was actually one of the contributing factors. But they didn't feel confident enough to try to break out of the blockade, because the Royal Navy was an absolute beast in its own right. But eventually, I want to say in like 1915, maybe 16, the German Navy actually did group up to try to make an effort. And the Royal Navy, kind of saw it coming, and so they organized, and there was actually just a full-on, huge-ass exchange of fire between a whole shit ton of German and British battleships and cruisers and whatnot. Interestingly, it was not a decisive engagement. I think the Germans technically got the better of it in terms of hits and damage on the other navy, but they ended up retreating too. So you can think of it as a kind of tactical victory, although the British were not like forced to flee either, but nominally the Germans did more damage, but it was a strategic victory for the British because they were able to maintain the blockade. And the German Navy did not try to break out again after that.
Saying the Battle of Leyte Gulf is higher tonnage, but the Battle of Jutland is one that is mentioned in this article here. I'll link it to you in Discord. It's just the Wikipedia of the largest naval battles in history. Has battles from 1944, which is Leyte Gulf, that's the US versus Japan, World War II. Philippine Sea, largest aircraft carrier battle in history.
Oh, yeah.
That's June 1944. Jutland, which you mentioned, is 1916. Lake Poyang, which is 1363. It's claimed to be the largest naval battle in terms of personnel, with a reported 850,000 sailors and soldiers involved. It's like
Wait, which one was that?
Lake Poyang. It's Ming Dynasty.
Oh, wow.
And then Battle of Yamen, which is 1279. It's the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty's conquest of the southern Song dynasty. 1,000 Song dynasty ships were destroyed by the Yuan dynasty fleet near Gamen, Guangdong, China.
Now that I can believe.
Red Cliffs, which is in 208 AD. The warlord Cao Cao and the warlords Sun Quan, Liu Bei, and Liu Qi. That's Romance of the Three Kingdoms stuff, right?
Exactly, I was about to say. Yeah, that's very famous in China to the point where Red Cliffs is actually a common reference. That's like this. You can say that this is the Red Cliffs for this guy or this country or whatever, and people will know what you mean because that's such a well-known reference.
Like a decisive moment or battle for a person.
Yeah, decisive battle.
And then Cape Economus, which is 256 BC, one of ancient Rome's first major naval victories over its rival, the city of Carthage, during the First Punic War. The Roman fleet had 140,000 men on board, rowers, other crew, marines, and soldiers. A number of Carthaginians is less certainly known, but estimated at 150,000. Most historians support this. And then the oldest one, Battle of Salamis, 480 BC. 371 Greek ships defeated 600 to 900 Persian ships in this decisive battle off the coast of Athens. Naval battles, yeah.
So going back to the Romance of the Three Kingdoms here, your pronunciation of the names was a little bit off. Yeah, your Mandarin is very good, by the way. I've heard that from multiple people now. So with the, it's not cow cow. The C in pinyin is pronounced TS. So it's, so his name is Cao Cao.
Cao Cao.
Bingo. And the Q is pronounced as a basically CH. So Chua.
Luchi.
Oh, Liu Qi, yeah. And then Sun Chuan.
Sun Chuan.
Yeah, bingo. And I think you got Liu Bei right.
Liu Bei. Nice. Yeah, I have a gift of mimicking stuff. Doesn't necessarily mean I have an aptitude for the language as a whole, but I can copy the sound as I hear it.
Well, it's more pinyin. Yeah, once you know the rules of pinyin, it makes more sense.
Yeah, because you have a lot of the same sounds in different languages. They're just represented with different things.
Yeah, Q is a little tricky because pinyin also has a CH sound for, well, I think it is just CH, right? You can actually just spell that, and that's also acceptable. I think the Q is meant to represent a very similar but slightly different sound, where you actually kind of swallow it. So it's not ch, it's more like sh. Something to that effect. I haven't mastered it myself. But there's a couple letters in pinyin that are like that, where they sound similar, but you're supposed to swallow them a little bit, such that they sound slightly different. I'm sure it makes all the difference if you're a Mandarin speaker, but for me, it's mystifying. I find it all very difficult.
Yeah, we don't have a tonal language with English, so there are a lot of different ways of saying what we consider to be the same thing. And it's funny when you are ignorant of a difference in pronunciation of a certain thing, especially if they're kind of similar to each other. My parents had a funny one in France where it's not de, it's a du. And they're like, that's the same sound.
Yeah, it takes a good ear in order to kind of pick up on those things, and I just don't have it.
Yeah, well, practice and exposure is everything, so I would guess that if you lived there and you had to do it, you would figure it out. Reading it seems like more of a pain in the ass than speaking it.
I actually prefer that.
Oh, yeah?
That's more to my, the reading and whatnot, that's more to my strength. Still not necessarily good at it, but I'm better at that than I am trying to immerse myself and learn by listening. My tin ear just doesn't facilitate it.
Yeah, but here's to all the beautiful languages of the world. May we share information across language boundaries so we get a less biased perspective over time. Amen.
Oh, I've got somebody from Moldova listening. Interesting.
Are you looking at the flags?
Yeah, I'm looking at the flags.
Shout out to our global viewership here this evening. We have 15 from the United States, 3 from Canada, 3 from Russia, 2 from Australia, 2 from Germany, 1 from Brazil, 1 France, 1 from Georgia. Nice. 1 from Poland. Elaser. And then some people opt out of this, so it's not broadcasting all of our viewers' locations. I think you have to agree to give Twitch some information. It's one of the things you probably clicked yes to.
Understood.
What about writing the language would be more annoying? It just seems like traditional Chinese is one of the most visually complex languages to write. Not necessarily annoying, I mean high difficulty compared to other ones that are simpler or closer to what I currently speak, which is English. Well, cool. Well, you basically filled the 3 hours anyway. I got out of a game so we could chat about stuff, but as soon as we started talking about carrier ships and naval battles, then there was a lot of ground to cover, so good work, sir.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you. And thank everybody again for the fundraised money for the PC. I was running around today buying parts.
Hell yeah.
On sale. So the ball is rolling on that. It's probably just going to take a bit longer.
Good shit, good shit.
Gotta find the right case and motherboard.
Mm-hmm.
I'll probably get the same motherboard, but from what I was reading, since I was doing prep work to try to prepare for building a PC, apparently you kind of have to be careful to get the right motherboard combination with the case and the other parts, because it's possible that they could basically overlap such that they don't all fit together.
Yeah.
And I want to get a different PC case, basically, than the one recommended, because I kind of didn't want one with tempered glass. I don't trust myself with tempered glass. Not in the least. So I'm going to fish around for something else. And I just want to make sure that I do all the right research. You know, all of the prep work has made me extremely paranoid, even more than I already was. There's a lot of stuff that can go wrong. So I got to do my due diligence on that stuff. But thank you all very much. That was very, very kind of you guys to do that.
Hell yeah. Chat asked, did you pick up a webcam?
Oh God, no. Nobody needs to see my ugly fat ass.
He looks like Hugo Weaving, chat. Just imagine that. That's why we have the emotes. Neuro Smith. There you go. Wow. Look how handsome and chiseled he is. Look how convincing of an elf or android he is. Or robot. What a handsome lad. Well, cool. Let us know in the progress. And if you want us to double check a build, I'm not the computer wizard who knows about like compatibility of parts and how to min-max the current PC building meta. But many people in my chat are up to date on all of that. So if you wanted to spit back a build that you were thinking about getting, we could check that for you if you were unsure. But you've done a lot for us. You've given us many, many, many hours of education and entertainment, so this is your bonus. Congrats. We look forward to seeing you cruise in games in the highest graphics with the smoothest frame rate.
Inshallah, assuming all goes well.
Hell yeah. Well, cool. Well, thank you for your time. Thank you, Fuzzy Coat, for any questions. And thank you, chat, for weighing in. And we'll see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.